Welcome to the course. My name is Greg Vanderford. I've been playing chess very seriously for most of my life and studying it very hard for my entire adult life. I studied it with masters and grandmasters in Vietnam, where I live and where chess is very, very popular. There are a lot of grandmasters here. And I've got a few courses on openings on the internet, and I consider myself to be an opening expert. At this point, I've studied them very, very intensely and used all different kinds of openings in my repertoire. And openings are super important, especially if you play online and you play a lot of blitz. Blitz can be a game as long as 15 minutes per side. 10 or 15 minutes is still considered blitz. And even going up to like 30 or 40 minutes per side, which means like an hour long or greater than an hour long game, is considered rapid. So traditional chess is a much longer format, and most people just don't have time to play a lot of long chess games. And so the openings have become even more important than ever before, because if you know the openings really well, you can blitz out your opening moves and be sure that you're making strong grandmaster moves that are considered to be the very best book moves that have been analyzed by computers and grandmasters for many, many years, especially in the case of this course, which is all about the Sicilian Defense. This is by far the most popular opening, and yet a lot of people don't really understand it. There are lots of different lines and variations in this opening that you can go into depending on what your opponent plays. And so it's really important for you not just to know the opening moves, but to know each different variation and the key ideas behind the variation. And that way you can adapt. If you're just like memorizing opening moves, but you don't really know what you're supposed to be fighting for or what strengths that you're supposed to be getting in that position, then you're not going to be able to adapt when your opponent inevitably makes a surprise move or a move that's different than what you expected from the book. And this happens a lot at the lower levels. If people don't know the openings very well, you're going to be like, okay, I'm learning this new opening, I'm going to use it, and then your opponent varies from the opening after like one or two moves. If you know what you're trying to achieve with that opening in the first place, well, then it should be even easier to achieve it if your opponent isn't playing the strongest book moves back at you. Usually we'll be going for some control of critical square or giving yourself certain attributes of the opening, like having an open file or strong central pawn or something like that. So when we understand those things, we can play off of that strength into the middle game. And in blitz games especially, when you know the openings really well, you save time and make the best possible moves. It gives you a big advantage on the clock and in the position. So it's really powerful in blitz and especially in lightning games. If you like to play like 1 or 2 minute games, which is just really, really fast, right? Knowing the openings might be the key skill in doing well in those types of games. You're not really thinking that much during the first maybe even 10 or 15 moves. If you're playing at a pretty high level, you know, strong player, they will also know the openings well. So you can bust out a bunch of really strong moves, get a big advantage, and then not use up all your time on the clock. So the Sicilian Defense is very, very rich. It's been played and favored by Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov and many players throughout time because it's fun to play. There's lots of chances for both sides. It's considered to be a sharp opening, so there's a lot of tactics involved, and it's very, very complex. And yet, you don't need to be a really strong chess player to understand its goals and how to play it. So it's popular and fun at all levels of the game, and especially with 4 or 5 key variations to it, it's really important to know them. So we're going to go through the classic variation, which I'll just show you the moves for right now, and then we're going to go through all the most popular variations that you need to know, some of which your opponent will not be very familiar with, which is really good because then you will surprise them and they will be at a disadvantage. Because of course, always our goal in the opening is to get some sort of advantage, put your opponent on the back foot, give them a disadvantage. So obviously, if you're taking this course, you know that the move that starts a Sicilian defense for black is 1c5. Put your pawn on c5 instead of the typical e5, and you are seeking to be aggressive. You're counter-attacking in the center as opposed to just mimicking white's first move and having symmetry, which is considered a strong move, but it's more passive, whereas this is much more active. You're seeking active play as black in the Sicilian defense. But not only do you need to know how to play the Sicilian defense as black, you also need to know the variations of play as white when your opponent chooses to respond to e4 with c5. So we're going to be studying both white and black and how both should be playing and what you should both be trying to achieve in all of the important variations of the Sicilian defense opening. So after c5, if we're going to go into the open Sicilian, later on in the course we're also going to study the closed Sicilian, which is a bit more popular at the higher levels of the game with grandmasters and stuff. It's more strategic, it's more closed position, and it's not quite as popular, although it can still be really fun to play. It can be a surprise weapon if you know the closed Sicilian really well for white, because black may not be prepared for the position that you're going to get. But the open Sicilian typically starts out like this. White will play knight to f3, black will play d6, and what makes the position an open Sicilian is that this move here, when white plays d4 and these pawns are traded off, it opens the board. If this move is not played, like instead if it's played to c3 or the knight comes out instead and these pawns aren't traded off, it will not be leading to the open Sicilian position. So we trade, and then black plays knight to f6. And the final move of the classic line of the opening of the Sicilian defense before it breaks off into other variations is white will defend the pawn on e4 with knight to c3. So this is the beginning sequence of the Sicilian defense. And after this, we can go into any number of variations. If black chooses right here to play g6, that means we're going to go into the dragon variation. It's my favorite to play. It's really fun. But at the very highest levels of the game, these days, the top players in the world, they almost always play the Najdorf or a similar line to that. It's been analyzed more deeply and it's considered to be more solid for black. But if you're not a grandmaster with a 25 or 2600 ELO rating, the dragon is a very viable weapon. It's really fun to play. You can get a lot of wins with black. It scores really well. It's just that it's considered to have like a few minor weaknesses to it if you're playing against the strongest players in the world, because they're finding like the absolute best moves all the time. And some of the top players have not scored very well with the dragon in the higher levels of tournaments and stuff. But since most of us aren't, obviously if you're taking this course, you're not a grandmaster, it doesn't really matter. So if you play g6, that goes into the dragon, and we're going to, of course, learn about this opening. It's going to be the first ones we cover because it's the most popular one to play. It's one of the most important ones to know for club players, which is what we are. We're certain club amateur players. Maybe we play in tournaments, play online. We have various levels of skill, and so this is an opening that you're going to see a lot. And so we're going to fianchetto our bishop, we're going to castle, and we're going to achieve certain things with the dragon opening and that line. Okay, but if we don't play that, if we choose instead to go e6, this is considered to be a very, very solid opening. It's called the Scheveningen variation, and what you're basically doing is you're setting yourself up defensively for white's oncoming attack. You're basically going to almost let them attack. If they play properly, they're going to play f4 here, or they're going to set up something that we call the English attack. I'm going to show you later in the course. And they're going to try to attack your king. But when you have your pawns here like this, you can set up your situation in such a way that you can kind of nullify their pawn storm. And then once their attack fades, in theory, then you will have a counterattack on the queen side. And that's the purpose of the Scheveningen. And it's just very solid, and it gives you a good position no matter what. A lot of these defensive solid openings also lead to really good endgames for black, which means that it might favor you to trade off a lot of pieces, because when you go into the endgame, you've got a really good pawn structure, and you should have an advantage in converting once you get to an endgame. So we'll talk more about that later in the course. And then we're going to look at the very popular amongst GMs, Najdorf, the Najdorf variation. So when you play a6, this is the popular line. And we'll see why when we study this in depth later on in the course. Putting this pawn here, it stops not one, not two, but three pieces of white from coming down here and making a check or getting the knights to make threats. And so this stops that, and then it leads to another rather aggressive opening position, opening posture, where black has a lot of good chances to attack on the queen side while also having a really solid setup. And so this leads into the opening that Garry Kasparov and Bobby Fischer both loved to play and scored very, very well with. So that move marks the beginning of the Najdorf variation, and we will see how that one continues later as well. We're going to look at a whole bunch of different variations in each one of these openings, because you need to know lots of variations. You can't just need to know the opening moves. You need to know if your opponent plays this or that, what do you do then? And then finally, we're going to look at the closed Sicilian. So as I mentioned, if somebody doesn't make this d4 pawn move and trade right here, what type of an opening are we going to have? Normally the closed Sicilian will actually start out with white playing their second move, knight to c3 instead, because they're aware of the fact that these open Sicilians have a lot of chances for black and a lot of dynamism in the position for black. That's why we choose to play the Sicilian defense. So when they play the closed position, they're trying to take all that away from us and go into a more tame and strategic type of position. But that's fine. If we know this opening as well, we play knight to c6 instead, and usually both sides will fianchetto the bishop, and you're going to be playing a different type of setup, and most of the time black will not be all that familiar with the closed Sicilian. So they may not know exactly what to do, and that gives you an advantage. So normally we might see both sides fianchetto, and basically what white's doing in the closed position is they're giving themselves a position that looks like the King's Indian attack, which is where you fianchetto your bishop and you put your knight over here on e2 instead of f3, because later on we're going to prepare for this f4 pawn push. When the position is closed, then it's more safe to move the king's pawn forward, or any pawn in front of the king forward. And so I'm going to show you guys how later on in this position we're going to be able to play this move at the appropriate time, and we're going to attack the king. So even though this is the so-called closed Sicilian, if white knows how to play properly, white gets a really good attack anyway, even though black's trying to avoid that aggressive pressure from white and keep the position closed. We can see that we can line up our pieces, and at some point, depending on what moves are played, and at one point in the game, we will be able to maybe break open the king position and attack the king on this side. So we're going to go into a whole bunch of different lines of this opening as well. So the Sicilian defense is really fun. There's a lot to know. It's never ending. And the more you learn how to play different variations, the more you're going to enjoy playing in blitz games, and the better you're going to score. So I hope you guys enjoy the course. And the next lesson, we're going to go straight into the dragon variation. So as I mentioned before, the Sicilian dragon may be the most popular form of the Sicilian, and it's really fun to play, and you get a lot of really similar positions out of it, which is really great, so you know what you're trying to achieve. So let's just go through it, and I'm going to give you as much information as possible in this lesson. I've got an entire couple of courses on openings where I go very deeply into this really rich opening, and it takes like a whole entire course to learn all the variations for both black and white and everything. But I'm going to give you guys as much as I can in one lesson so you can go out there and use it effectively in your game. So let's just get straight into it. So we know we go e4, c5, the knight comes out, our pawn goes up, and then 90% of the time white will play this move. They know the opening and all, they know the lines that come out of the open variation, and they get a really good attack. White has something called an English attack, something called the Yugoslav attack, there's a Fischer attack, and we're going to learn all of those later in the course, and they're very effective attacks for white, which is why we really need to know the opening and how to defend against those, and then get our own counterattack for black. So we trade off this pawn, which is actually a good thing for black. We're trading a c pawn for one of white's central pawns. So in theory, we benefit a lot from this exchange, but white gets a temporary strong center, and their pieces are coming out very effectively. So in chess, you're usually giving up something in order to get something, and then the side that wins out will be the one that over time makes the best moves, understands the position more deeply, and gains an advantage, creates weaknesses, and eventually tips the scale in their favor, which leads to a decisive attack on the king, or winning some material and then converting into an end game. So we play our knight out, And they put their knight out, and this is where we go into the dragon. So we play g6. We're going to fianchetto our bishop. If white knows the opening, they will immediately play this pawn move, usually to f3, in order to stop the black knight from coming down here and threatening the light squared bishop that wants to be placed on e3 here. This is a natural formation for white to put their bishop on e3, put their queen on d2, and be prepared, especially when we have a fianchetto bishop, to try to trade off that bishop later in the game when the time arises. Because whenever you have a fianchetto bishop, the whole point of fianchettoing it is to make it a strong piece that aims down this long diagonal. It's one of the reasons that this position got its name the dragon variation, because this position with the open board has such a strong bishop right here that we say it breathes fire down the board. It's a fire-breathing dragon. It's such a strong piece, and also because of the shape of the pawn structure right here, it kind of looks like a dragon as well. So that's why it got called the dragon variation. And so we're going to fianchetto our bishop. White will continue with their plan of setting up their skewer here, this battery of these two pieces. We will castle immediately, right? Castle early and often. We almost always want to follow that rule. Very rarely will we not want to castle our king. They'll put their queen there, and we will just continue with our development. We're going to knight out. If they want to trade knights here, that's fine with us. We'll take with this pawn, and we'll have a really strong central pawn structure and an open b file. We can put pressure on this pawn and have them make concessions. A lot of lower level players do this. If I play this move, usually if it's a really low level player, they won't get to this position anyway because they won't know exactly how to set everything up. But when I do this, even players rated 15, 1600, they'll trade off this knight. And this knight that they have for white, it's a good piece, it's in a good location, and they've already moved it twice. So trading it off for this black piece has only been moved once, and then strengthening our pawn structure is not a smart thing to do. It doesn't make any sense, basically. So you don't have to worry about them taking that knight and putting your pawn here and derailing our plan of setting the opening up like the way you learn in this course. Your opponent will make different moves than you're going to see in this course. At some point, they will vary from it, which is why we need to know what we're trying to get out of the opening, and just follow the moves as best we can, and then adapt when they vary from it. In theory, when they vary from the book moves, that means they've made an inaccurate move. It's not as good as the book moves. So that means that we should be able to take advantage of it in some way. But to follow up with the opening, we're going to continue to develop and set up our pieces on these really good squares. Black's going to have this open or semi-open C file, so it makes a lot of sense for us to move one of our rooks here and aim it down the board. White is going to usually castle long and attack our king. It's a very dangerous attack. This setup right here works very well for white in many, many different situations, because against a fianchettoed king, you want to try to trade off the bishop, as I said. You want to pawn storm. You got your rooks aimed down here, and it's very dangerous. So we need to know how to defend against it. But if you know the best moves to use to defend against it, we can successfully do so, and then we can counterattack on the other side and hopefully win the game. You've got to know some of the key moves. Okay, so after they castle on, we're going to continue to develop. We're going to get our bishop here. We're going to get our queen out, usually to a5, which does a couple things. It threatens this square if this knight moves. It threatens to trade off the queens, because black has a really good endgame setup here, a really strong pawn structure. And if these bishops come off, and if white has a strong attack and we're able to trade off the queens, that alone will usually nullify the attack on the king. Usually you need your queen for a good attack. Once the queens come off the board, the position will slow down without all of that power of that major piece. Not always, but usually that's what happens. So we can trade off the queens, and then we have a really good endgame position, and we can also attack their king with the pawn storm ourselves. So usually we want to get our queen here. This queen being on a5 also does the extra thing for us of helping to defend this really important h5 square. As we'll see, when white makes their pawn storm, we want to defend this square, and we want to keep these pawns closed. Whenever your king's being attacked by a pawn storm, you want to keep the position closed up. You don't want to allow it to be opened up, because that allows the attack to come down on your king, and pieces can get pinned and traded off, and there can be sacrifices and you can get checkmated. And so this is why this is a really dangerous attack for white, which is why this is a really fun position to play for both black and white. But from black's point of view, if you know how to defend against this, not only in the Sicilian defense, but these patterns that you learn with this opening can also be used in lots of other openings. And so we're going to learn that as well. So we get the bishop out. Usually white will want to bring their bishop out to c4 because it pins this pawn, and then when their attack comes later, and if they are able to trade off some pawns right here, you can't take back with this pawn. Or if somehow this gets traded off, the bishop's aimed at the king, so it adds some pressure here, and it gets the piece out so the rooks can be connected, and so it's a really popular move to play. Okay, and then usually what they will do is they will tuck it away over here, so that if a rook comes here or a queen goes here, then they're not under any threat of losing that piece to a tactic because it's not defended right there. So usually they'll just tuck it away right away. Okay, so let's say for example we play queen here, the bishop comes down, and now this pawn is being defended twice, and everything is fine. So a typical thing that might happen now is that if it's a really strong player, they will oftentimes also move their king over here, so there's not this gap, because once these pieces get moved, this is a threat. So they usually take a move to move their king over. Black wants to move a rook over. It makes sense to move this rook over on the c file. It's aimed across from their king on this semi-open file, and also it makes it so if white tries to prematurely trade off this bishop right here, you can just tuck the bishop down here. This is a little trick that we use when you want to keep your fianchetto bishop from getting traded off. As long as that rook's not here on f1, once you've moved that, you can just tuck your bishop right here, and this is fine. White's not gaining anything by doing this, by trying to trade off the bishop. We just avoid the trade and we keep our strong bishop. And notice it's aimed all the way down this board. It's aimed all the way down to here at this b2 square. There's no pawns in the way, so if there are theoretically attacks on this knight, our rook is also aimed at this knight. So sometimes you want to sacrifice the rook here, called sacrificing the exchange, right? To take a minor piece. The rook and queen are called the major pieces, and the knight and the bishop are called the minor pieces, right? And so usually you don't want to trade a rook for a minor piece, but sometimes it's a really good idea and it can lead to an attack, and oftentimes it will be unexpected because most people don't expect you to trade a higher value piece for a lower valued piece. But sacrificing the exchange is one of the favorite types of sacrifices among strong players because you're not giving up all that much, and it can lead to some really good stuff for you. So, but let's say they don't move that bishop down there just yet because it is premature, it doesn't really accomplish anything yet. Later on they can try to trade it off. And now notice we have two rooks down here, and once we get these pawns going, we can very quickly attack white's king with our queen being where it is and all our pieces being where they are. Usually though what happens is white's attack will come even faster because they're set up to touch our fianchetto position more quickly. So they'll play something like g4 and the attack will come. And we just continue to develop. If they do that, we're not worried about anything yet. We might play this move here, knight to e5, and we're threatening this f3 pawn. It's defended, but that makes this so this knight can't move. Otherwise, you can take it with a tempo on this queen. So this knight's got to stay put. We're also threatening to go to c4 right here and threatening to trade off this knight for this dark squared bishop. And if we're successful at doing that, now this position, or this bishop right here, our dark squared bishop, is even more powerful because it has no threat from the opposing dark squared bishop to trade it off. So now this piece becomes even more powerful than it was before. It becomes almost as powerful as a rook. So usually a good player won't let us do that. If we play knight to c4, they will trade their light squared bishop for this knight, and we'll just have a trade there where both sides get something. This light squared bishop is also a good piece for them. It's aimed down on their king. So by trading off this knight for that piece, it weakens his defense of this square, and we're trading off one of their good pieces for one of our, we could call this knight a good piece, but its primary purpose is to make this trade and sort of soften up their king position. So this is a good position, or a good move to make. Usually white here will go ahead with the attack. See, the pawn storm is coming fast. Now this is a key move in the dragon variation. It's been analyzed for literally decades. The strongest move to play right here is to play h5 immediately and stop it. If they continue to try to open up immediately like this, we can just take that pawn back with our knight, and the position is closed. And then we just leave our knight there. It's closed. It can't be opened up. If this light squared bishop was over here instead of here, which some people like to do, it's a little bit more dangerous in this sense because then they can push this pawn forward and threaten to take our knight, move the rooks over, and that's dangerous as well. There's lots of different variations. But in this case, it's closed now, and their attack is pretty much stopped. They can push this pawn forward and knock this knight over, and we can make the move I said previously, but their attack is coming more slowly. We've got lots of ways to defend, and again, another reason why we put our queen here is because it's also another way to defend this. So a good player won't immediately take that pawn because it doesn't achieve what they want, which is to open up the position and attack the king. So at this point, they're going to bring over more reinforcements. Now again, if they try to trade off the bishops here, we just avoid it like this. If they try to take this now, we just take it back. So this is how you defend, and everything will be fine. You're going to have an equal position, and now you can counterattack. So it would be an ineffectual attack if white does that. And a lot of white players will be impatient, and they will just try to open everything up like that, but you have to calculate, and they realize that they don't have quite enough firepower to make a successful attack yet. And if they do this, this is even better for us, because they think, okay, I'm gonna lodge these pawns up in their grill and make this knight move. But actually, this is a closed position now. There is no attack. I mean, the pawn's gonna go here and maybe come here. It's slow. It doesn't work. We can just move our knight over here. The position is not going to be opened easily. So this is actually a really good thing. This means their attack is pretty much done. If you're the attacking side and you're using a pawn storm, then you don't want the position to be closed. You want it to stay open. Okay. So that's not a good thing to do. So typically, what would white do then? White would probably just move a rook over and do something like this. Maybe move the queen over and get ready to take here. Now maybe they can take. And then when we take with the knight, now they can maybe look at some sacrifices, right? They've got this bishop right here. And so now if they take and we take with the knight, the rook could take this pawn, theoretically, depending on where these pieces are. And this pawn can't take back. So now it's starting to get a little bit more dangerous. But we're going to make this move. And we're basically going to force white to trade off this light-scored bishop. So these are the themes that you're going to see. These are the positions you're going to see. And depending on how your opponent plays, it's not going to be exactly the same, right? But this is a really typical game. I've literally played this exact position to this spot, these exact moves, probably 100 times. If your opponent knows the opening well, they will make these best moves. But it will also vary, and you can play many number of other similar scenarios also hundreds of times, depending on which rook you move over, depending on where they put this light-scored bishop, depending on the exact move order. It changes things. And so that's one of the reasons why the Sicilian Defense is so fun to play. There are millions of variations, and they all play on this similar theme of black's going to be putting pressure on the queen side, white's going to be attacking on the king side. Each of these pieces is going to be serving a similar function in all positions. The battle between these dark-squared bishops is going to be going on. The battle between these knights and this bishop is going to be going on. This theme between what the queens do is going to be going on. And it's just very interesting. And so we're going to be looking at different variations of this type of position throughout this whole course. And I'm going to try to link it together so you can see, even though each variation of the Sicilian and each variation, each line are different, we're following a similar theme, and you need to basically become fluent in all of them so that no matter what your opponent plays, you can go into a line that you know well and get a good position. The accelerated dragon is a good example of how just a change in move order and a slight variation on the opening can lead to a very different type of a game. It's one of the reasons why you need to know lots of different variations, because if it goes into this different position, what are you trying to achieve now? It seems like it's the same opening, but the game will be entirely different. And the name Accelerated Dragon is kind of misleading, because accelerated makes it sound like somehow maybe it's even more aggressive or attacking. But actually, the accelerated dragon often leads to even more positional types of an opening rather than the really sharp exchanges and attacks that we see in the regular dragon. So let's look at some of these differences and what type of position you may expect to get here. So we start out with the same moves, but oftentimes in the last lecture, you guys saw that in the dragon we played d6 here. But in the Sicilian, the oldest classical variations actually play knight to c6. But later on, grandmasters started to play d6 first instead. And so they're both considered to be like classic variations of the Sicilian. And you can usually play either knight to c6 first, or or d6 first, it slightly changes the move order, but usually leads to a transposition into the exact same opening. So if you see knight to c6 be played by somebody, or if you want to play that instead of d6, it will usually lead to the same thing. But in this case, if we're going to play the accelerated dragon, we usually play knight to c6 first, and then we will hold off on playing this d6 move, because at some point, depending on what white does with their light squared bishop, we might play d5 and strike the center and have a different style of game than in the traditional dragon. So they will usually, again, go ahead and play d4 immediately, and you will trade off that pawn. That's the main theme. And then this major difference between the regular dragon and the accelerated dragon is that we will immediately play g6. We're not going to play this knight to f6 first. We're going to get the bishop fianchettoed immediately. We're going to aim it at this knight, and we're going to mix up the move order and look to potentially go d5 in the center. And if white knows what they're doing, they will put their bishop on c4 to help stop this d5 push. And if they do that, then we will have more of a similar game to what we saw with the regular dragon, and it'll kind of transpose into a regular dragon, depending on which side that they castle on. Or if they don't do that, if they put their bishop, for example, on e2, which is a pretty natural place to put the bishop as well, then we're going to look to play d5 and strike the center. So instead of having this kingside attack on both sides like the regular dragon, we're going to have more of a standard struggle for central control, which is usually the goal of an opening in chess. We want to get a strong central position. We'll be fighting for the center. So the accelerated dragon puts you in a position to help to fight for the center more so than the regular dragon, which kind of just gives up the center and aims for these queen side pressure and advantages. So they'll still play the knight out. We'll play our bishop out. And then usually here they'll play this bishop out here to e3 first. Since we haven't played d6 yet, like in the other line, they're usually going to hold off, if they're a good player, on playing this f3 pawn move and then go into the Yugoslav attack. The attack that I showed you guys in the last lecture, where they attack the king side with this setup with the queen bishop here and everything, it's called the Yugoslav attack. I neglected to mention the name of that. And so it's a really common theme, as I said, but it doesn't always make sense depending on how black has set themselves up. So in this case, in the accelerated dragon, both sides are kind of looking to see what your opponent is going to do. And so they're kind of waiting to see. So by putting this bishop here, they set themselves up so they could go into the Yugoslav attack and castle queenside, or they could go castle regular and fight for the center. Again, another alternative is that if they play this bishop out to c4 immediately here, then they're looking to stop this d5 pawn push. So I'll show you a couple different scenarios. So if they go there, we're not going to play d5 right away. We need to get this knight out and everything, but we just accelerate the fianchettoing of this bishop to put pressure on this knight and change the move order, give us a little flexibility. This can also confuse our opponents. If we're playing a blitz game and they're not used to this move order, they might make a mistake and do something wrong, and then we'll get an advantage. So let's say we play this knight out, and let's say they don't bring their bishop out. They just bring their queen out and they set themselves up like they're going to go maybe into the Yugoslav attack. And now once we castle, let's say they just castle along immediately. Well, now we're in this position where we can theoretically play d5 right away, because we're striking the center, and if they take and we take, then now our bishop's really, really strong right here. And if a big trade-off of pieces happens, we've got a really good position now. Remember, white has the initiative when they start the game. So any initiative that we can get as black, or any equalization, is good. And so this position looks really good for black. White doesn't have any attack. There's no pawn storm coming here. And this pawn is under threat right now, so they're going to have to move a piece to block it or move the king over. It's usually prudent to move your king over and adjust your king position. So let's say it takes a move to do that. Now we can bring our bishop out if we want to, depending on this knight. We can, let's say we've got 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking this knight. They've got 1, 2, 3 attackers. So we could go for even more of a trade, which would go into a really equal endgame. We probably don't want to do that so quickly. We can start a pawn storm ourselves and start pushing these pawns forward. There's a lot of calculation that we need to go into the game at this point to decide what's the game plan and what do we want to do. But basically, we will have achieved a major portion of what we want in the opening if we can equalize this quickly as black. So if white neglects to play the bishop to c4 and we can play that d5 pawn move, we're putting ourselves into a really good position for a good game. If we want to trade off the queens, we can force a queen trade, which also may be advantageous for us. We have these two really good bishops here aimed at the king, and we can have a pawn storm. It's going to be a really close struggle and a really balanced position. And if you can get that with black, that's usually really good. And in chess, usually you'll come to a point after the opening where there will be a lot of calculation needed. You're going to have to spend maybe a lot of time on one move because it's such an important move that will decide the fate of the game, which way the game will go. Another thing you might want to think about doing in this position is just simply moving this rook out and aiming it right here, aiming it across from the queen, and then later on you can move your queen. Maybe you have an attack there. It also serves the dual purpose of avoiding this trade once again, as we saw in the dragon. And all of these variations of the dragon, we want to avoid this bishop trade if we can. Keep this dark squared bishop. It's a powerful piece, especially if the queens come off or some trades happen and you still have your dark squared bishop aimed at their king. It can lead to some good things later on. So we want to keep that bishop. Moving the rook over achieves both of those purposes, and we can now fight for a win in this game. Okay, so the key thing we saw there is that white neglected to play bishop to c4 immediately, and they went ahead and they set up themselves for a Yugoslav attack. But in this case, it doesn't really work so well because we can play this move right here, d5. Okay, so that's a key idea in the accelerated dragon. Now, if they do go ahead and play bishop c4 right away, well, we're not going to play d5 because now they have three pieces defending that square. They are controlling that square very well. In this case, what we're going to do is continue just like we would have in the original dragon. So we basically would have transposed into that position. Or, since they haven't played f3 yet, we can also try to annoy them and play knight to g4 and attack this dark squared bishop. We can trade off this knight for their dark squared bishop while keeping our dark squared bishop. It increases the power of this piece because they no longer have an opposing dark squared bishop to challenge us. He can't put his bishop here and try to trade it because our knight's controlling that square. He can try to avoid the trade by moving here or here, but that runs into maybe some more annoying things. We can put this pawn here because we've got a knight and a bishop on it. You'll have to calculate the little tactics or, the complexities of the actual moves in this situation, but that's something that can be very annoying for white, and a lot of players will elect to do that. Also, if he moves this bishop over here and he's not careful, notice that we have this bishop and this knight also attacking this knight. So if he makes a move like this, it's a big mistake because now we can just take this knight right here. It's defended, and we would win a piece. So that can be a nice little tricky thing to do. Okay. Otherwise, we will want to play d6 and transpose back into the regular dragon. So you see this a lot in different various openings. You'll transpose into a different main line depending on the move order, and that's okay. And at this juncture, he'll probably go ahead and play this f3 move, and now we go right back in to the other line that we saw before, and you will have something like this. Okay, and now we're familiar with it, we've seen it, we know what to do, and it's going to be a really fun, interesting game. And we can change up our moves, or if we know that these are the strongest moves and we're familiar with the position, it can be a really good idea to simply play these same moves and put some pressure on this knight. This is a common theme, put pressure on this knight. At some point, we can sacrifice the exchange, as I said. Let's just give you an example of that and do this. Take right there, and let's say he really wants to open the position. He's going to move this guy forward. He wants to attack this right here. Well, in some cases, we can immediately take this knight because this knight was defending this square here. Okay, he can't take it with the queen because our rook is defending it. So when we take this knight right here, what happens is he's forced to take it with the pawn. And now we can either go ahead and just win a pawn back, which is not what we want to do because we just sacrificed a rook for a minor piece. Instead of winning this pawn, we want to take advantage of the position. So now it's very dangerous for them. If we can put our bishop here, which we can't do right now because the knight can take it, now we have a big threat here. So if we can get this knight to move somehow, or we can move this knight back, and even though it allows them to push his pawn forward, which is what we didn't want for their attack to succeed, we have an immediate threat. We can take this pawn, so they can't do that. So we can take this pawn, make them move the queen, and now we have a lot of momentum. We have things coming. We can make a check. We can reattack this queen. There's lots of things we can do, and now black has the initiative. White can't do this because that just closes the position. It doesn't get him anything. So the attack's over basically. I mean, it's a sharp opening for both sides. That's why it's so fun to play. Both sides has a lot of chances here. There's a lot of things that we can do. Okay, so it's a really fun opening to play. Oh yeah, this queen's under attack by the knight, so we can't do that. And you'll see lots and lots of different attacks happening on both sides. And so even though I've showed you guys a couple variations that are almost identical, one change in move, it leads to a totally different situation. And so you'll never get bored playing the Sicilian. It's really, really fun. You can play thousands and thousands of games. I played a tournament in Spokane, Washington at a chess club there. And I think I played 5 or 6 games in that tournament, and every single one of them was a Sicilian Defense, both as white and as black. Everyone knows the opening. It's really fun to play. And every single one of those 5 or 6 games with the Sicilian, it led to different lines and different variations. A couple times it was a dragon, a couple times it was a Najdorf, because I played white and they chose to play the Najdorf, right? You don't know what your opponent's going to choose to play. And so we went into those lines, and it was a really fun tournament, and all I did was play the Sicilian the whole entire time. And since I know this opening more than the rest, I had a really good score, and I won most of my games, and it was all because of my preparation. Like the course that you guys are taking right now, for me, it's going to help you a lot when you get into games in the Sicilian and your opponent doesn't know the themes as well, and they don't know the lines as well, and you're going to win a lot of games because of this, especially in blitz. Now the Chinese variation of the dragon is yet another adaptation that evolved out of both players, on white or black, gaining some advantage by having some new move or some novelty, as we say in chess. Garry Kasparov and Viswanathan Anand, both former world champions, were playing in a really important match in the 1990s, and they were introducing new moves into this very old opening. And it was found that certain moves changed the advantage from black to white or vice versa. And so then one of the moves that avoided one of those other lines was a move we're going to learn in this lesson that turns it into the so-called Chinese dragon. And it also, once again, it changes the nature of the opening, and it will take you into another very interesting line. And so we start out with the very typical dragon, and then we get down into like the 10th or 11th move before we change something, and it's black that makes the adaptation. So again, we're going to see the familiar opening, and you're going to want to see it lots of times so you can see the patterns and the different changes. And a lot of times it'll transpose. The move order won't be exactly the same as this, but it will transpose into the moves that we see. So same thing, d6, trade off this pawn, take out the knight, go into the dragon, play f3, normal stuff, castle. They set up their Yugoslav attack position, take our knight out, they castle. We got to put our bishop on d7. Pretty much any time we play the dragon, we got to put the bishop there. It doesn't make sense to go anywhere else. However, sometimes I should note that we may, at some point in the game, decide that we trade off this knight in order to surprise our opponent, or depending on what's going on in the game exactly, it may behoove us to have our bishop here on e6 aimed over at the king over on this square right here, depending on where the pieces are. Usually you don't want to block in your pawns, the bishop. So this move looks kind of weird if your goal is going to later on to be to move your pawns forward and attack the center. But in the dragon variation of the Sicilian, we're not really doing that. We're going to be attacking the queen side. So we can put the bishop here, and with that knight gone that was on d4, we don't have to worry about a knight coming down and attacking its bishop. So actually, it really can't be dislodged very easily. It also, in this case, it stops the white bishop coming down to c4 into that really strong square that it was being put on before. And if they want to do something like play pawn to b3 in order to put that bishop here, well, then we'll trade it off and we'll give them an ugly stacked pawn position in front of their king. That wouldn't work very well for them. So sometimes you want to mix it up, especially if your opponent's really familiar with the lines you're already playing. Knowing that you can do this, trade that knight off and put the bishop right here, it's yet another way to play the position. And now we have two bishops aimed at the king side. In this case, the dark squared bishop of white is now aimed across from ours though, which is not really great, because then if we move this knight, it can be traded off. It's just a theme that's worth knowing about, that you want to have the option to be able to do. And again, it can surprise your opponent if they're not expecting you to do that. Okay, so we're going to go the main line again, bishop here to d7. And oftentimes, white, they'll take their bishop out, like I said, or they'll immediately adjust their king. This is something that is a strong move because it just makes it so that later on when the black attacks comes, it's in a good position. It also avoids, like if the white or the black queen goes here and this knight moves somewhere later on, it avoids this queen being captured and traded off with a check. And so that's kind of an important thing. Like for example, if this knight goes here and we want to trade off the queens now and go into a queenless game, this knight could take this pawn with check, assuming this knight was gone. Let's say, for example, the move order went, takes this knight, we take back, and then he goes here. Since this queen's not defended, we can't take this knight right now. We'd lose our queen. We pretty much have to take the queen. But since we can't, we're not taking the queen with check, he has this in-between move, like we say, called an intermediary move or in-between move. He can take this pawn right here with check, and now he won a pawn. I got to move my king, and now he takes back the queen, and he's won a pawn, and his knight's in an annoying spot. And we can attack that. In this situation, it looks like he can't get out without losing material. I'd have to analyze this more to see if it works or not. But this is a common theme that happens depending on what the situation is and the move order. This happens sometimes. So that's one of the reasons why white wants to move the king over, among many reasons. The other one being just to keep it safe. It's not as safe when it's on this position right here, and we are going to be attacking on that side. So let's just say he goes ahead and moves that king over right away. Well, one thing we can do, we can immediately move the queen out like we said we were going to. Although in this particular situation, moving the queen out here, it loses to this really annoying knight to b3. And then we just have to move it back. And if we move it back here, the knight can attack it again and we can put it here. And actually, if we put our queen here in this situation, it looks kind of ugly, like it's not in a good spot. But later on, depending on what white does, let's say for example, I don't know, white decides to move his bishop out now, which wouldn't be a very good thing to do. The knight's right here. It actually makes less sense. So in this situation, it would make more sense for white to put their knight or their bishop right here, and that will support the pawn storm. But just for an example, if this does happen, now you can knock this knight back, and now we can start a pawn storm, and actually our queen is now in a really good position to push this pawn forward, and we have a really powerful attack. So now, let's say for example, we go like this, we dislodge this knight immediately, he's got nowhere to go except for maybe he can go here, and then we can attack it with this, and it's just going to lead to a really interesting game. I mean, you can trade these things off, but we have an attack going on here. And now later on, even though we just made some trades, we're going to be able to say whatever. We're going to be able to attack here, and it's going to be a really interesting race for a checkmate. And both sides' attacks are coming really fast. That's just an example of what can happen. But I would prefer not to go down into that line, so I wouldn't play this queen move to a5 yet. When this knight is here, I wouldn't do it. What usually happens is that this bishop will come out first, and then we can play, and then we wait for him to tuck it over to b3, and then we can play the queen out. But we're right now learning about the Chinese dragon, right? So the typical move in the Chinese dragon in this position will be to play rook to b8, or we can play knight to e5. So the move order is really interesting. It just depends. If we play knight to e5 first, and they want to kick our knight off, now we can attack the bishop, and the only place it has to go is all the way back here in order to keep itself. So that's fine. Later on we can put it back here. That's something that's really annoying. That can happen if we play that move first. Or we play this move and they don't want to do that, so they won't play that move, and they will just continue to develop. They will then bring their bishop out. This is the main line. Oh, they can't do it yet because of the knight. Sorry. Let's go back. I just want to show you guys the main Chinese line. So you would play rook to b8 here. This is a lot different than bringing these pieces out and moving the rook over. And by doing this, you're saying that you're going to push this pawn forward and you're going to attack this way. And it tends to work really well, and it can surprise your opponent when they're not ready for it. They're probably just going to say, you know what, I don't care. I'm going to bring my pieces out like I was and continue my attack. But now we can play a6 and a5, which means our attack will come quickly. We can attack the knight immediately right here, make him tuck away, which is what will usually happen, and now we just play b5. This is the main line. And even though you have two knights in this pawn, we have two pieces defending it, the bishop and the rook. We are also setting ourselves up to play knight to c4 and trade that off. And if we did trade that off in this position, let's say for example white plays here immediately, and now we go like this, white's pretty much going to be forced to take this knight because they don't want to trade off this dark squared bishop. And now we have a rook aimed at the king, and the queen can come over here, and we have a nice attack coming. That's one thing that could happen if they decide to go ahead and just pawn storm right away. Anything that opens up the position of the king, like if they want to play a6, for example, is not smart. We want to keep our king position flush and defend it with the pieces. We don't want to be moving the pawns in front of our king unless we absolutely have to, depending on the position. I mean, in this case, if they do that, we're going to open it up. We're going to be able to open this position up, and we're going to have a lot of threats. So it's not usually a good idea to do that. You know, so this is going to be a good position for black, and it leads to a slight variation on what we saw before that might surprise white. So white, instead of pawn storming right away, as we see that they have this move, it's kind of annoying, they might go ahead and try to trade off this bishop right away. And in this case, we're going to let them. We're going to go ahead and make this knight move, or let's say they take this bishop first. We take it back, the knight moves out of the way, and so we've allowed them to trade off a really good bishop. I said don't do that, but now the position is different. They haven't started their pawn storm yet, and so it's not as dangerous, and we have an attack in our own right coming. And so we can now push these pawns forward. Now if you notice, now they're going to have their pawn storm. Now it's tricky for them. See? He'd be forced to put his bishop here. Let's say we take it. We trade that off. He brings his pawn. Oh, he just took back. See, now we're attacking their king. And it's not easy for them to keep things closed. And so things are dangerous for white. They can try to keep it closed. We can take here. We can bring our pieces over. I'm just giving you guys examples. But now our pieces are coming swiftly. And even though they have an attack as well, a tempo over here. Now we're going to lead into what usually happens towards the end of a well-played and hard-fought Sicilian game is that you will have a really sharp attack on both sides, as we saw with the original dragons. One of the reasons why it's so fun to play, there's a lot of calculating that you'll need to do. I'm just giving you guys some examples. Once the position opens up or the game varies, you're going to see all different types of stuff happening, lots of fireworks. And so it's really fun, but knowing that you can play this rook to b8 and then push this pawn, it can change it up on your opponent, especially in a blitz game if you're playing a Sicilian against somebody over and over again, and they're used to seeing the regular Yugoslav attack in the normal dragon setup. By varying and playing rook to b8, pushing that pawn forward, oftentimes black will get a decisive attack, and it can surprise your opponent. And that's what it's all about in the opening, and in blitz especially. Getting something that puts your opponent on the back foot and surprises them is a good thing. So it's definitely useful to have the Chinese dragon variation ready to go in your back pocket when you need it. So I already showed you guys the Yugoslav attack setup, and it's a setup for white. And I showed you guys how to defend against it for black. We want to play h5, and you want to keep the H file closed at all costs. Because if this gets opened up, white can even sacrifice a rook, sacrifice the exchange, take the knight, open things up, and still get a checkmate. So very, very dangerous attack. So I want to show you now from white's point of view. So if you're playing white against the dragon, how can you most effectively open up their king side and get that coveted bishop trade and the big attack? It's really fun to play for both sides. So I'm going to show you guys how to play the Yugoslav attack for white and try to get a checkmate on the king here. So, of course, we know the normal moves are going to happen. Trade, trade, trade. Go through those. Go into the dragon variation. Castle, castle. Bishop out. Say we move our king over. Okay, we're not going to show the Chinese line anymore. We're just going to show the regular main line. So in this case, we'll assume that black plays this queen out there. And in this case, if we want to attack quickly, we're not even going to bother with playing the bishop to f4, which is actually, that variation in many lines is known as a Fischer-Sozin attack. We're going to look more at that later in the course and the very, very best ways to play off of this bishop. And one of the reasons I already mentioned that we put that there is to avoid this pawn coming down here. We're just going to go straight for the jugular. And we're going to play either g4 or h4. So a lot of times we play h4 because we're just trying to go for speed here. And we're going to look to get this big attack. And actually, if we're going for speed, we may not even move the king over. We may just leave it on c1. But it's just prudent to have it there. And it's usually worth moving it over and using one move to do that. If black knows how to defend, as we know, they're going to play h5. We're going to immediately go here and play g4 in many cases. And even though, if you notice, they have 1, 2, 3 pieces on this, like takes, let's say they take here, it might be premature because now we can't quite push this pawn forward. They could take it. We could look at maybe sacrificing the exchange. It looks like in this case we probably were a little bit premature. We want to do one more thing before we play this move. We want to move this bishop this time to e2. Okay, so that attack probably would have failed and black would have defended and then counterattacked us. But by moving the bishop to e2, now we are ready to attack here. Let's say they move their rook over to either this spot or this spot. Either place is typical. They may do that. We're going to attack anyway. And now, if they take, let's say, any move order, basically, if they take it, we're gonna take here. And if we go here and he takes it with the bishop, now we can sacrifice the exchange because we have this trade coming. If he moves the rook over, now it's really dangerous. We have checks, we have the queen coming, and it's really, really dangerous. We may or may not get a checkmate here, but we're going to get a really dangerous attack. I'm not spending a lot of time calculating this, but there's a lot of good things that can happen by this type of a setup. Okay, we can even do something like this, make that queen move back, take this pawn. It's very difficult for black. They're just going to have to defend now. We have a lot of options here, and maybe we're going to get a checkmate. Just notice this knight here is hanging. So we would probably want to move this knight here. And that's a good place to put him anyway, because now we have more threats, and the knight's in a good position, and the queen can no longer defend this pawn. And so we're going to get a big attack, even though we had to sacrifice material. That's just one example. But the king's on the run, and we're going to have a big attack. That's just one example. Okay? And they might not like that, and they may be scared of that. Another thing we could do, besides immediately playing g4, is that we can now go to try to trade off this bishop. Since the rook hasn't been moved, he can't just tuck it. Like we said, if they lose the exchange, they just lose material. And so there's really not much you can do. They'll probably want to move his rook out anyway. Now we trade it off, and now we play this move. And if takes, we also, you just have to calculate. We also, instead of taking back like I just showed, we can just push this pawn. And now if he says, oh, it's fine, now we can sacrifice the exchange this way and do something like this. Very dangerous. Bring our rook over here, and now his king's in trouble. He's going to probably want to tuck it back. And now we can take this way. This, check. In this case, it would be checkmate. So there's lots and lots of dangerous things that can happen, and a lot of times we can sacrifice a rook to open this up. It's very, very dangerous. I mean, those are just a couple examples. There's many, many different combinations of moves depending on what your opponent decides to do. There's a lot of calculation involved. So once you get to a position, even this position, like once you're here, you got to calculate a lot. If you play g4, they have 3 different options of taking that. Probably they'll take it first at the pawn because it's defended by a pawn. But you got to calculate. Do you try to trade off the bishop first? Do you play g4 first? Do you move the rook over first? Maybe instead you go here, give him time to do his thing, and now you've got another piece defending this. So now you can just take it maybe. See, now you would win a piece. So obviously that makes it strong. You're not sacrificing anything, and your attack is still coming. And so it's really dangerous. They got to figure out what are they going to do. Probably they won't take it now. They can't take it. They have to just hold. And then you're going to be in a situation where, depending on what they do, let's say they push this pawn forward, which is pretty typical. I can't take it because it's defended. Now, if you take here prematurely, they can just take back, and there's nothing you can do immediately. You can maybe push his pawn forward and attack the knight, which would be really dangerous. He can attack your knight. Maybe you move back. You trade off this knight. Oh wait, you move back here, and that gives him time to do some stuff like this. You don't want this trade to happen. I'm just showing you guys some examples. Who knows? But now we have this threat, take this knight, but this is one of the reasons why the queen's over here. The queen can defend. So again, you're going to see a lot of different variations, a lot of really dangerous stuff going on for both sides, and so it's very, very interesting. You're never going to have the exact same game, but you're going to have a really similar position with really similar goals for each side. So the Yugoslav attack is very dangerous, it's very effective, and if black doesn't play this move right here, this key move, h5, it's really, really dangerous. Let's say, for example, he doesn't do that. He just goes ahead and plays some normal move. Now our attack is going to be even stronger. Let's just say he goes here because he's going to start a pawn storm. And we don't want to play this move here and knock this knight off. We don't want him to be able to close the bishop. We want to go here to h5 and open the position. Okay? Now, if he continues to ignore us and just do his thing on the other side, which a lot of opponents will do, they'll think, oh, it's not too dangerous, I'm going to attack him. Well, it's going to be harder for them. We're going to, in this case, usually you can either sacrifice exchange immediately, as I already said, because now the h file is open, or you might want to take one move to move this bishop over here. Although if you do that, the knight can come down. So again, you have to calculate. But let's say we take this. Now it looks like we sacrifice something for no immediate attack, but there are lots of things we can do that will lead to an attack. Let's just say we want to move this queen back somewhere. Now we can move, like, for example, this queen over here, attack this pawn. There's really not much that he can do to defend that pawn, and so he's going to be looking like, what can he do? What can he do? Maybe he'll want to put his knight over here. And now we're going to look to, well, we could take this pawn right here. We sacrificed an exchange, but we opened up the king side. We already won one pawn back. It's very dangerous. He's going to have to play defense now. He won an exchange, but he's going to have to play defense now. And we're going to bring more pieces into the attack. And it's going to be, you know, an interesting game. See, can we checkmate him now? Can we trade off this bishop now? Maybe, maybe not. And so that's just kind of a really quick overview of how the many ways that a Yugoslav attack can lead to a really big position through a sacrifice, or in many cases it will lead to an outright checkmate if your opponent doesn't play it very well. So it's a fun position to play. Say he goes here, doesn't want to trade, fine. Instead of sacrificing this, let's see, instead of playing this move, which I just showed, we can do something different. Instead, let's say we move this queen over immediately, and we don't make the knight move. Instead, we try to make this knight move by moving these pawns forward. Say, for example, something like this. Or we just leave that knight there. Go here. Doesn't matter if he takes his pawn. The whole goal for us is to get a checkmating attack. So we're even going to leave maybe pieces hanging in order to get a checkmating attack and trade off these pieces. It's just an example. Just want to show you how dangerous it is. Check. Now there's nothing you can do. It's checkmate. It's just really easy to make a mistake defending as black, especially if you don't play that h5 move right away. So if you're playing for black, you got to play h5 right here. And if you're playing for white, you want to open up the H file. That's what you're trying to do. And there's many different ways to try to do it, as I've just shown. And if black makes one tiny mistake in the defense, he will probably get checkmated or lose material and lose in an endgame. So the Yugoslav attack is very, very dangerous. And in later lectures, we're going to look at the English attack, which is almost the same exact setup for white as the Yugoslav attack, except for it works against the Najdorf and against the Scheveningen. And it's a similar way to play. So for white, you can play against the Sicilian in almost the exact same setup, no matter what they do. So it's a good thing to know for white. And so it just shows you how rich and deep this opening goes for both sides. classical Najdorf was named after a Argentinian grandmaster named Miguel Najdorf, who played against Bobby Fischer several times and famously lost a game in his namesake opening, the Najdorf. Bobby Fischer used what then was considered a novelty. It was the Adams attack, which we're going to learn in this course, to defeat Najdorf himself in his own opening, which is pretty cool, and it shows us the power of certain lines, and it also shows the power of Bobby Fischer, because he used a move that became a super strong grandmaster move like in 2008 after computers showed how good it was against the Najdorf, because it's a really subtle pawn move, and Fischer used it way back in 1950s and 60s, and so it shows you that he would either discover these novelties on his own, or he would see someone else play something and he would recognize its power after some deep thinking about it. And so we'll learn about that in the Adams attack lesson. In this lesson, we're going to just go over the very basic positions of the Najdorf and kind of explain why it's such a popular response to e4 for black. Basically, the reason it's so popular, especially compared to the dragon variation and others at the highest level, is that it's super flexible. When you play the sixth move A1, or excuse me, A6 with your pawn, it leaves you open. You can transpose into the Scheveningen, which we're also going to learn about. You can even still transpose back into a dragon, which is a different move order. You can see what white is going to do. Are they going to try to use the English attack or Yugoslav attack or the Keres attack, or how are they going to set up their position? And so it allows you a lot of flexibility, and it also just simply avoids some of white's best attacking formations. For example, a lot of people play the dragon, they get checkmated by that Yugoslav attack that I showed you guys, and it can be really hard to combat if you don't play really good defense. A lot of people don't like putting themselves in that situation. If you play a strong chess player and they play the Yugoslav attack against your dragon, you can lose some games that way if you're not really careful. I'm not worried about it because I've studied it a lot, and I like the counter-attacking chances. You nullify their attack, and then you can get a checkmate on your own. It's just really fun to play. But for a lot of people, they don't like having to be put under that pressure because it's almost impossible to avoid a good Yugoslav attack if you play the dragon, at least in terms of them like reaching your king faster than you will reach their queen side. So it's almost impossible to avoid having to play maybe a little bit of defense or making some prophylactic moves, as we say. So let me show you guys why the Najdorf is so flexible. And you'll see lots of different positions with it, which is why you can see this game being played over and over and over again. And every time there's this tiny variation, a slight move order change or whatever, it leads to some cases drastically different positions. So we see the same moves. We already know what the Najdorf is. So we play a6. Now, even already, white can respond in lots of different ways. They can go to the English attack, which is basically the same as the Yugoslav attack, only it's a different name because in the position of the Najdorf or the Scheveningen, things are different. You're not fianchettoed your bishop on g7, and so white still sets his position up like the Yugoslav attack, as we'll see here in a moment, and it works against all the Sicilians. So if you play the Sicilian as white, setting up that Yugoslav attack / English attack setup, that pattern, it works against all of them. So it's a good thing to know because you don't have to change how you play against other openings. However, as you get better, you're definitely going to want to learn different attacks and different ways to approach the position, especially if like you're going to play one person multiple times. You want to be able to give them different variations and change it up on them and stuff like that. So let's say white chooses to play bishop e3. It's one of the solid moves here. And then this is the key move in the Najdorf if you go into the classic main lines. You play d5. If you just play d6 here, that's going into a Scheveningen, which is a very solid defensive position, which has become less popular now, as I'll show you in a later lecture, due to something called the Keres attack, or there's another one called the Hungarian attack, which have been very useful, very powerfully used against the Scheveningen. And so if your opponent knows those lines, it can put you under a lot of pressure. So the Najdorf avoids the dragon, it avoids the certain lines in the Scheveningen, and it's really aggressive, and it also allows you to be flexible. So usually the knight will go back over here to b3, and then we will play bishop to e7 and get ready to castle. Now this looks kind of weird because normally we wouldn't want to have like a backwards pawn here on d6. It looks like a weakness, But in this particular position, computers and grandmasters have analyzed it's solid because it can be defended with both your queen and bishop, and later on we could push it into the center if we choose to. We can also even play f5 depending on the position later on if we choose to. And while it looks like this square is a nice outpost for white's knights, you really can't do anything from there. We're not really worried about that. So it's not something that you need to worry about. Certain positions like this, things look like a weakness. It's like I showed you in the dragon when you put your bishop on e6 and you block in the pawn. It's usually bad to block in your pawns with bishops like that. It hurts your development. But since you have fianchettoed and since you have no plan to move that pawn, that's part of the dragon formation. It's a really natural place to put the bishop as long as it can't be easily chased away by a knight, which is why sometimes we trade off that knight. So this is a position you gain a tempo by knocking that knight back, and then usually you'll either play bishop to e6 or you can just castle right away here. So I'm going to show you guys a couple different variations, a couple different move orders, just so you can see the really good position that you get as black. And remember, the goal of the opening for black is to equalize. It means to take away white's initiative that they get from moving first. And so the Najdorf does this very well, and it gets an equal position very easily. So you're not going to be getting a whole bunch of fireworks. A lot of times the Najdorf positions will be relatively strategic and positional, depending on what your opponent does, depending on what white does. But you're going to get a good position pretty much no matter what, and it's going to be a nice strategic game. It's kind of like a Spanish opening in the sense that it's going to be very strategic in every single case. You're not going to have a lot of immediate, checks, checkmates, or attacks. And that's one of the powerful things about playing this a6 move. It stops not one, not two, but three pieces from being able to use this b5 square, because remember the knight was over here. And so neither one of these knights can go down, the bishop can't go down. It stops all those things, and it also prepares later on for us to play b5. In the Najdorf, you're almost always going to play b5 at some point and expand. It gives you this option of knocking this knight off this square again, which can be useful depending on what he does. And you get a lot of space on the queen side. And that's a key theme in all of these Sicilian defense openings for black. Okay, so if he decides to go into the typical English attack, right? Yugoslav attack in the dragon, English attack in the Najdorf. And he puts his queen on d2. We're going to follow this line. So we castle. He gets his bishop out, gets ready to castle long. Normally, once the knight's already on b3, the bishop doesn't want to go all the way up to c4 now because it can't retreat there. That square is being taken up, so it's not very natural. It's a natural place to put the bishop onto e2 here. So we'll take our bishop out. We can also, if we want to, and this is another reason why the Najdorf is just so flexible, we can play b5 here right now and then fianchetto our bishop and put pressure on this pawn. It's a matter of choice, a matter of taste. Both are popular. So I'm going to show you this typical move here, putting both of these bishops on top of each other on e7 and e6. This bishop is a good piece. It's aimed out at the board. This bishop right now is defending mostly this pawn. And so our white bishop in this case is our stronger of the bishops. It has more mobility, right? It almost always is going to be a good bishop and a bad bishop. As we say, one of them will be stronger than the other ones. Usually the stronger bishop is the one that is on the opposite color from most of your pawns, because your pawns will block in the other bishop and limit its mobility. It's like in the French defense, the light squared bishop is usually a really weak piece because it'll be blocked in by the pawns, and we're willing to accept the weakness of having a bad bishop in order to get the other benefits from the opening in terms of what you get from the French defense, the open C file and a really good pawn structure, other compensation like that. And so in this case, it's good to know that this white bishop is a good piece. So if white decides to just put the knight down here, which may be something that you're looking at, we don't really want to take it. If we take that, it lodges his pawn up in our face, and it's good for white. It gives him a lot of space. So while normally we don't want to let a knight just get a nice outpost like this, in this case, we wouldn't take it. We would just leave it there. And obviously, in this case, this particular move order, he's left his pawn hanging here on e4, so we can just take his pawn. So we can't actually do that yet. Anyway, this bishop is defended, so nothing is being threatened. He would just lose a pawn, so we can't do that yet anyway. But even if later on he decides to do that once, for example, if he plays f3 and defends his pawn, we're still not worried at all about him putting his knight here. The best thing to do is not to take it. If you watch any Grandmaster games, they will almost always leave it there, at least for a while, until something changes in the position, right? Because chess is dynamic, things aren't always going to be the same. Okay, so now he's castled long. We go ahead and play b5. This is a natural continuation. He decides to play f3 with his plan of doing the English attack and playing g4 and h4 and doing the normal pawn storm attack on us. It's often good to put the knight on d7 in this position because it clears the c file for a rook. And then he'll immediately start the pawn storm attack. We might put the queen here on c6. In this case, if he decides to play knight to f5, well, we probably will take it because we don't want to have to move the queen back and lose a tempo and then maybe trade. So these are just some examples. This is a typical classic sort of a Najdorf. And you see that you're going to have a strategic game. Black's going to be trying to put pressure on the queen side, probably knock this knight off this post. And notice that the queen's across from the king. And so while white has a good attacking chance with his pawn storm and the English attack, black has some pressure too because we've castled on opposite sides of the king. It's similar to the dragon in that case, only black's defense, the setup is much more solid than in the dragon. So very strategic, lots of really fun games that you'll get out of this. You'll move this rook over and you guys will both attack each other's kings. So that's just a very basic Najdorf situation. And there's lots of different moves that have been played. So now I want to show you guys if instead of going queen 2 and going into the English attack, a lot of opponents at all levels will castle on the same side in the Najdorf instead of going for that English attack. And oops, we want to go back here. Bishop e2. Why are you not doing that bishop e2 move? So let's say he goes bishop e2 and he's going to castle this way instead. So now we can get our bishop out, we both castle on the same side, and then they will typically play this move at some point. They'll play f4, and now the goal for white is going to be to move the queen over to the king side and attack our queen. So it's going to be different. We're going to play b5. If they do go ahead and push this pawn down, it's not really an issue for us. We just back it up. And now we can do a couple things. They might move their queen over and get ready to attack. We can knock this knight out here, and then we would win a pawn because this pawn wouldn't be defended. So this b5 move here, if their knight is on c3, which it almost always will be, we always have this option of knocking it off. And he's defending this pawn right here. So usually a premature push with a pawn right here, it will fail to a little tactic or to losing a pawn. So it's not good for them to do that. So we don't have to worry about that. And what he'll usually do is move the queen over first, or even move the bishop over like this and defend that pawn for that very reason. And then later on, if he wants to, maybe he can push his pawn, knock our bishop back, maybe move the knight down because now the pawn's defended. And so this is just basically a slow sort of movement of pieces for white over to the king side. Strong grandmaster players don't usually play this pawn move down here. They will either take this pawn or they will just leave this setup as it is and get all the pieces over and wait for the right moment to attack. Okay, so let's back it up. So instead of taking that right there, they might go something like move the queen over instead. Okay, and then we will simply continue to develop. So let's say we go here, and he might want to move his queen over to here, and now it's across from our king. Okay, we can't put the knight on h5, which we typically could do if both defending this and attacking the queen, because the bishop has it, and so white has a good attacking chance here. We don't want to take this pawn usually right here, because when he takes back, now this kind of is a weakness. It's an isolated pawn, and we're allowing his pieces to get out towards our king. So we usually just leave the pawn structure as it is, and we focus on either defending or expanding on the queen side. So for example, we can knock this guy off, and if he wants to lodge the knight up in here now, it's fine, because when you're being attacked, trades almost always benefit you. And now if we take this knight and he takes back, now he's messed up his pawn structure. We could do something like this, and this isn't a great position, but we've closed the position down. It's just an example. So trades usually benefit the defender. The attacking team will usually want to keep as many pieces on the board for the attack. So it's a good thing to keep in mind whether you're attacking or you're defending. Okay, so that's just a basic setup, basic example of what you'll see in the Najdorf. Queenside attack, on a queenside expansion for black, a kingside attack for white. If they castle on the same side as you, they'll usually rotate their pieces around by moving their bishop here and moving the queen over. This is a very typical thing to do. And depending on the situation, at some point we can expand here, we can expand here. We can do many things. We can expand our knight here, and there might be a lot of trades. There's lots of calculation that might need to happen if they decide they want to trade off pieces like this. I mean, this benefits black. Okay, so you notice there's a lot of chances for both sides. There's a lot of strategic stuff going on, and there's a lot of calculation that needs to happen. So it's a good game. It's really fun to play, and there's lots and lots of stuff. You know, I encourage you to look up and study it more. There's only so much I can show you in a short lesson on the Najdorf. But in the next few lectures, we're going to look at specific lines and how to counter those different attacks from white. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, the English attack and the Yugoslav attack are the same setup for white, but you can use them against basically any of the Sicilian defenses, which is what makes having them a big part of your repertoire as white really important. And the great thing about it is you don't need to remember a whole bunch of different move orders and variations and everything, especially if you're playing a lot of blitz or rapid, which most of us are doing now on the internet. Then this opening is great. It's a powerful attack. You can get it going almost every time, no matter what your opponent does as black. And it just makes it so you save time on the clock, make a lot of strong moves, and don't have to think too much. But of course, we want to know what to do against it if we are black as well. I showed you guys how to defend against it in the dragon, and we want to do something similar in the Najdorf. And so remember that basically when you are under attack, I'm going to keep bringing up these same things so you guys remember during your games. You want to relieve the pressure and either defend, counterattack, or trade off pieces. Trading off pieces almost always benefits the defender because it relieves pressure and it relieves attackers. Now, of course, all of these things are generalizations and just have to calculate to make sure that the trade that you're making will not hurt you or lead to some tactics. You have always to calculate. It just goes without saying, basically, at this point, that you always need to calculate between each and every move. But when you know the openings really well, when you know these lines, you have to calculate less, and you can make stronger moves more quickly, save time on the clock, and get a better position. So, same moves as before. We go into the Najdorf, and so they play f3 instead of h3. h3 is the Adams attack. f3 goes into the English attack. And so we're going to play the same d5 move, knock the knight back. The natural place for him to go is pretty much only b3. He can't go back to e2 anymore because they're not going to fianchetto the bishop like in the Adams attack and set it up that way. They're going to do just like we saw in the dragon variation. So we're going to castle like normal. They're going to set up their queen. Now, if they play queen d2 immediately, we play b5, and that stops this bishop from coming down to c4. That's a really good spot for the bishop in lots of these lines. Although once the knight is already on b3, it makes less sense for the bishop to go there. Usually the bishop want to go there earlier in one of the first few moves. And then that goes into the Fischer-Sozin attack, which we're also learning about in the course. And Fischer used that to great effect against the Najdorf himself. So we're going to look at that line as well. So playing b5 here, it just makes a lot of sense in a lot of these variations. It stops the bishop from coming down. It allows you to make this knight move if you need to, and it allows for expansion on the queen side. So this is what you want to see in the Najdorf. But notice, unlike the dragon, without the fianchettoed bishop here, Everything is much more solid. It's harder to open up the king, and it takes more moves for the pawn storm to reach the king when you're playing the Najdorf. So it's easier to defend in the Najdorf than it is in the dragon, but you don't have as much of an aggressive response either, because the dragon has that really good bishop aimed at the opponent's castled king, and it allows for those tactics that we saw in that lesson. And so here you can fianchetto your bishop, and they will start a pawn storm against you. And so we're going to keep developing. We're not going to worry too much about the pawn storm. We don't want to take time to move our pawns forward in front of our king. It takes away from our development, our counterattacking chances, and it also weakens the king. Almost always you want to keep the pawns flush unless for some reason you have to move a pawn forward if some tactics are about to happen where you're going to get checkmated to lose material, right? So you always have to calculate. But in general, we want to keep pawns in front of our king flush. It takes longer for the pawns to get there, and it allows us to make our moves. Maybe we'll put our queen here on c2 once again, opposite the opponent's king. If we can line up a rook and make a battery, and their opponent makes a mistake or later on fails to a tactic and has to move his queen, you can sometimes win this pawn and either get a checkmate, or if the king is moved, win a pawn with check, and it's just a threat that is hanging in the air that white has to always keep an eye on. Whenever we have these kinds of threats, we may not achieve winning a pawn or getting anything out of it that actually gains us material or a checkmate, but the point of it most of the time is that it keeps your opponent's pieces from being more mobile. If he has to keep a piece here to defend this pawn, once I have a rook over here, then he can't be moving as many pieces over here. He can't move his queen over and attack. And so we always want to have threats hanging in the air. The threat of moving his pawn forward and knocking that knight off. The threat of him moving a piece and having the queen bear down on his king and have this pawn be pinned. Now maybe we can put a piece here or here, depending on what his pieces are doing, and his pawn is pinned. So again, in chess, we do things that have multiple purposes. This is also just a naturally good place for the queen. It's taking advantage of this semi-open file. It's mobile. It can move over here later on if white's pieces move. And if we are going to move this pawn forward, there's going to be some sort of trade in the center with these pawns, then the queen's in a little bit better position to defend and to move over to that side of the board as well. If he wants to move his knight down here and attack the queen, we can simply go ahead and just take it because he's forced to take it back with his pawn. And even though that pawn is in the center now, he's given us one of his attacking pieces and he's disrupted one of the pawns from his pawn storm. So it doesn't really help white to do that. It doesn't make any sense. If white wants to go ahead and do that, well, that's fine with us. We will simply line up across his king and then wait for him to move his pawns down and either defend or attack depending on what chances he gives us. Notice that we can move these pawns forward as well. We both have attacking chances here. So that wouldn't favor white very much to do that. We're not afraid of making those kinds of trades. Again, remember that with black, you're trying to equalize the position. When you're playing the Sicilian, you're in a defensive position, although it's sort of an aggressive counter-attacking defensive position. And so trades like that will benefit you. White doesn't benefit a lot from making them. It doesn't really make much sense. White wants to use his moves to keep the attack going. And for example, if white can easily make a mistake in the attack too. If they go right here and they play g5 and they want to knock the knight back somewhere and keep their pawn going, well, in this case, knight can kind of block the attack, block the pawn storm, and put it right here. Yes, white can put his bishop here and look to threaten this knight, but the thing is, it's not a good idea. I mean, he might be able to win that way, but it allows the pawns to be blockaded or stopped, even if just temporarily, okay? And so you want to do anything you can to keep the position closed when you're defending. And your opponent wants to do anything they can to open the position against your king when they are attacking. And so a better move when you're in this situation, and you're going to see it a lot, is to simply play h5 first. And that way, later on, when you play g5, the knight can't go here, right? Because he can't take that pawn. It's defended, and now the threat is really serious because once he touches down one of these pawns with the king, we can ignore it, but he can capture it and start weakening our king and start bringing pieces over, and it starts to become dangerous. So we can look to do things like maybe put this knight here and push this pawn forward in the center and gain some space. We can knock this knight off, and we can trade off some pieces depending on exactly what is happening in the game. Now, if you move this knight, we pretty much have no choice but to put it here. Oftentimes, it can be a good thing to do to put a knight on e8 when you're defending, because you're defending one of the pawns in front of the king. And so when he comes down, if he wants to immediately come down and attack you, we don't want to take this. We don't want to open it up and allow his attack to come. Basically, we've got a couple things we can do here. We can put this pawn up on a6 and let him take here and just take back, which wouldn't be all that terrible. His bishop has no tactics coming down, but he has weakened our king, and he has allowed his queen to get lined up again. So starting to get a little bit more dangerous, but he doesn't have any kind of a decisive attack yet. We can simply ignore it and choose to maybe move his knight back out. And if he takes here now, we can take it with the knight. Either way, he's going to start having some chances. So be really, really careful. But we don't want to usually move our pawns forward before their pawns get down. It takes time. And we can choose to totally ignore that instead and just counterattack. We can just leave it as it is and look for some active play. It depends on how aggressive you want to be. I mean, maybe you threaten his queen and threaten to trade here. We'll probably trade this off. Now we traded off this piece, or we can even take back here the pawn and make him move this knight. He doesn't really have anywhere to go, so he has to go back. And notice now we're getting some momentum with our attack as well. So it's not just white that has the chances, it's both sides. We can choose, if he does something like this, to leave everything closed and just ignore it. Don't take back that pawn. A lot of times you want to just leave a pawn in front of your king, one of your opponent's pawns, and don't take it back. It closes a position. Whether or not that works will depend on the position you'll have to calculate. But in this case, notice it keeps it closed. There's no easy way for him to attack you. And if he wants to bring his pieces over now and attack this g7 pawn, that's one of the reasons why it's nice to have that knight. Now we have a knight defending this pawn, the only pawn that's vulnerable, and we have two pieces defending it. Now we can't move the rook over here because of this pawn, but we could take this with our king at a later time. We can move this bishop right here to f3, and he can't easily attack this piece. Meanwhile, we have some threats going ourselves. He can't move his knight. We can trade off the queen, or we can take this pawn if he moves the knight. And so it's just a really fun strategic game to play. Both sides are going to have chances, but black, you just need to know how to defend and know some of the typical things to do. Okay, so that's one example of how a English attack will play out. And white will usually benefit from being really patient. When you're attacking, you don't want to just barge through. To this point, white has been doing a lot of good things, but now this would be premature. Notice that we saw that you can defend against it. So don't be in a rush when you are in the attacking position. Set up your pieces so that your attack will be really effective when it finally does come. For example, this bishop hasn't been moved yet, so it makes sense to take this bishop out and put it either here on e2 to support the attack and allow the rook to swing over, although that blocks the queen, or you can even just put it here on d3, and notice it's aiming at this h7 square, so if anything moves here later, it'll be in a good position and it doesn't block any of these pieces from coming over. So let's say, for example, you see something like this. Now white can move the rook over, and we're just going to be playing some normal chess. Maybe now we want to open up the center here, get some space. If he takes, now we're taking, and it's going to look really good. So white won't want to take right there, probably. Just keep swinging pieces over. Now he's got lots of pieces lined up on our king, starting to look really dangerous, but now maybe we can relieve some pressure, open the center up, look to have some of our own threats, and we're going to be playing some really fun chess. Okay, so the English attack is a great weapon for white. It's good in all of the Sicilian defense positions, but if you know how to defend against it for black, then the Najdorf is very playable. And as I said before, even though you might have less attacking chances than in the dragon, it's easier to defend the Najdorf than the dragon. And when you're playing blitz, the goal is to be able to make a lot of strong moves quickly so that you save time on the clock while also getting a good position at the same time. As mentioned in the previous lecture, the Adams attack has been used very effectively against the Najdorf. The Najdorf kind of nullifies a lot of White's plans in the Sicilian, and so this really small, seemingly innocuous move that we'll see that starts out the so-called Adams attack, which is named after a master from like way back in the 1950s, it subtly undermines the e5 move in the Najdorf, and it just leads to a really comfortable attack from White that's very, very difficult for Black to refute. And so this is a really good example of how a really small change in a position can make a big difference because it changes the move order, or it gains a little bit of time, or it changes the structure in a subtle way that ultimately changes the game. So it's very instructive for that reason. So we see the very normal first moves, put in the Najdorf, and this is the move right here, h3. Seems like a strange thing. And yes, it does keep the bishop and the knight from coming down here, but mostly what it's aimed at doing is counterattacking this position where you have e5 being played, which goes into the Najdorf and has the knight go back over to b3. And it's a slight improvement because now when Black plays d5, they play immediately. Instead of going to b3, the knight can go to e2. It's not blocking anything in here because we're going to fianchetto the bishop and play g4. And so by playing h3, it allows this harmonious development of White's pieces into this new setup where you fianchetto the bishop here, you're going to play g4 with the pawn, and you're going to play knight to g3. And you get all your pieces mobilized over here on the king side, and Black can't really do much except for do its normal development. So if they just continue with normal Najdorf moves like bishop to e7, White will play g4 and expand. And notice that White is now expanding pretty rapidly over here on the king side. It's good development. Even though he took a move to play h3, it allows for so much harmonious development afterwards that's worth it to take the time to play h3. Notice if you remember our Yugoslav attack and our English attack, we have to play f3 and then g4 and then h4, and it takes multiple moves. Well, now we're sort of killing two birds with one stone with this h3 move, and it leads to lots of other good things. In chess, we're always trying to save time. It's about moving your pieces efficiently. So every time you make a move, if you can do something that is both defensive and offensive, that's good. If you can do something that is both strategic in terms of prophylaxis, in terms of the positioning, and then leads to something else that you want to do with your other pieces later, that's good. We can't be thinking in terms of just one move. We can't even just be thinking in terms of tactics and looking for combinations. We need to always be thinking of how can we get the most out of each move that we make with our pieces. So h3 is that kind of a move. It's kind of hard to see if you just made that move by yourself. You wouldn't see the major benefit to it, but it's because it leads to this totally different position, basically. So we fianchetto the bishop. Let's say we play b5 like normal. Now we castle kingside, and a good way to play against this h3 move, against the Adams attack, grandmasters have analyzed, is to fianchetto the bishop as well. And then if you get the opportunity to later, just trade these bishops off, and it can nullify that strong bishop and kind of weaken the king position a little bit. So this has been the favored way to play against it at the highest level, instead of putting your bishop on e6 like we saw before. So again, the Najdorf is super flexible because you can put your bishop here and fianchetto it on b7. You can push it on, put it on e6. You can put your knight on d7. You can put your knight on b6. And each of those subtle differences has a really big difference on the position. And now this bishop is helping to defend the d5 square, putting pressure on the e4 square, and allowing for harmonious development of your pieces as well. So again, we have a strategic fight in the Najdorf that kind of gives both sides a lot of chances. But if you're a player who often comes up against a Sicilian and doesn't do well against her, doesn't like playing against the Najdorf, especially because it's so effective, it's so solid, then playing the atoms can both surprise your opponent and allow for this nice attacking chance that you have. And most people won't be really familiar with what to do against this. They'll see the Yugoslav attack and English attack so often because they're so popular now. If you start getting up into higher levels of play, these types of variations will become more and more effective. So let's continue normally, bishop to e3, like we normally see. Get our knight out. And now white can start an attack immediately if they want to. They can knock this pawn off, put this knight down to a not very good square. It's pretty much the only place it can go that makes any sense. And now white is already expanding and putting pressure on the king side. He can easily start moving his other pieces over in this direction, and you've got yourself a good attack going in the Najdorf, which is known for being solid and not easily attacked. It doesn't have the fianchetto bishop position that allows for the Yugoslav attack and the castling on the opposite side. The reason that we play d5 is because it knocks that knight back and it puts our pawns in the center, right? We're usually fighting for the center. It allows us to have a solid position, and then we can play b5 and we can expand the queen side and we get lots of good chances. But in the atoms attack, all of a sudden the pawns come down really fast and the pieces come over to the king side really quickly, and white is almost guaranteed to get some sort of pressure, some sort of attack going here against the black position. So it's a really good opening for surprise. It's a really good opening just if you don't like to play against the Najdorf. Usually, you know, black kind of has to untangle here. He doesn't want to play d5. He could play this move b5 right away, but the knight can now come down, and it's kind of annoying. So it's kind of tricky. We can play this knight, try to improve this knight, maybe expand and play d5 now, or maybe just reroute the knight to e6, which probably would be a good thing to do. It's tough for black to find a lot of good moves here, and so especially when you're playing blitz, putting your opponent in any position where they're on the back foot, where they're having to think a lot, or where they're unfamiliar with the position is a good strategic choice. So the atoms attack is a good strategic choice. So most people will be unfamiliar with it. They're used to the other openings. They have to take more time to think about their moves. They can more easily make a mistake. Meanwhile, your plan is very clear. You can just bring your pieces over. Look, you can bring the queen, even right now, all the way over here to h5 or h4, right across from the king. It's very dangerous. Notice his knight can come down, his pawns can come down, and black's pretty much going to be forced to play defense. He can't easily get his pieces over depending on what he does. He's going to probably want to try to trade some pieces off here if he can. But in this case, notice it fails. He's got too many. He would lose material in this case. Actually, that would have worked out well if you were able to successfully do that. But white simply doesn't have to take. He can just let it go there and continue to rapidly advance or attack. Okay. Actually, I like putting the queen here better, because then black does this, we can just push these pawns. There's a tactic there. Count that. Okay, so there's lots of calculating that you need to do. The goal of my course isn't to show you all the combinations and tactical variations. A computer can do that, right? And it's super complicated. The goal is to show you guys the patterns, the positions, and the typical setups, things that you want to be able to think about. You're going to have to do your own calculating in the game. But the Najdorf, it's a very, very good weapon for black. It's more and more popular at the higher levels of the game because it nullifies a lot of white's most popular and dangerous attacks and gets a really good position. So playing h3 and going into this setup in the atoms attack can be very effective. So definitely go out there and try this in your games to see if you can't get some good wins with it. So the Fischer-Sozin attack has been used very effectively as white against the Najdorf. As you can tell from the name Fischer-Sozin, it was played by Fischer, also by a grandmaster named Sozin, but they popularized a opening that was played in the 1930s by another grandmaster. So it wasn't really popular, it wasn't used all that much until Fischer brought it back in the 70s and used it with great effect. And so the key move order that turns it into the Fischer-Sozin is that on the sixth move, white plays the bishop out to c4 immediately. That makes it so the b5 move can't be played and stopping the bishop from moving out. Instead of playing f3 and going into the regular Yugoslav attack or English attack patterns, we're going to be playing against f7. Okay, so we'll just go through the move order really quickly again, just so you guys can see it, get really, really familiar with all the moves. Sicilian, takes. We say we're going to play the Najdorf, and then they go Fischer-Sozin. Now, what this does is it stops black from playing this e5 move now. Because if black plays e5, the knight can simply go back to f3, and now this bishop is aimed at f7. It's dangerous, and this bishop can't so easily come out. It would get traded and have a really ugly pawn doubling right here, and if b5, we just leave it back, it becomes a really important piece as part of an attack later on. And this d5 Najdorf setup has been weakened, basically. It just doesn't work as well anymore. So what tends to happen in order to refute this powerful bishop and not have any weaknesses in the position for black, instead of playing d or e5 here, they'll simply play e6 and transpose into a Scheveningen type of position, which we're going to learn a lot more about later in the course. And the Scheveningen is a really solid setup that has become less popular due to a couple of certain attacking lines by white that, if your opponent knows really well, can be very dangerous. And of course, at the grandmaster level, they all know all the themes and popular attacking lines against each defense. So what they're doing at the grandmaster level, since they're all so good at calculating and they're all so well read, is they're doing a lot of strategic decisions about which opening lines to play against which opponents, how to employ them. There's a lot of psychology going on there. Like when Bobby Fischer famously opened a game with the English opening, which he had never played before in his whole career as a chess player in serious competition, but of course which he knew very well because he was a great grandmaster and had studied all different types of chess positions, and so he used that against Grandmaster Spassky in the World Championship match, and it surprised Spassky because Fischer always opened with e4. Fischer once famously said e4 is best by test, it's the best opening. He didn't believe in playing a lot of d4 openings back in the day, and so Spassky wasn't as prepared to play against Fischer in an English opening where the first move is white plays pawn c4, and Fischer played a really amazing game and defeated Spassky in decisive fashion, and Spassky even stood up and clapped because it was such an impressive display of positional chess. But the psychological impact of Fischer playing an opening that Spassky wasn't ready for, not that he didn't know it, Spassky had played that type of a position probably thousands of times against other grandmasters, but he wasn't prepared to play that position against Fischer. And so it surprised him, and who knows how much of a psychological impact it had, but it's one of the famous games from that World Championship match. Okay, so we basically, as black, if they play the Fischer-Sozin, instead of playing the e5 move, we transpose into a Scheveningen. Now in the Scheveningen, you may or may not play a6. So basically what we have is a Scheveningen where a6 has been played. So this happens a lot when you're playing the Najdorf. And again, that's one of the reasons the Najdorf is popular. It's very flexible. I mean, you can even transpose into a dragon for the Najdorf. There's no really point in playing a6 first if you plan to play the dragon. But depending on what your opponent does, if you decide that you want to, you can. Or maybe you want to play a6 first, so your opponent starts to set up like they're going to play against the Najdorf, and then we play the dragon instead. So there's lots of things you can do out of the Najdorf basic position. So in this case, once we play e6, now if white wants to go into their regular English attack setup, we simply set up in a very solid way here. We can knock this bishop back to b7, and we can either put our bishop on d7, and continue to defend this, or we can fianchetto it on b7. But it's usually a good idea to simply defend this pawn right here, and you're going to have a very defensive setup. Now, white still may go into the English attack here and do the same things that we've been seeing, but it's not as effective. It's similar to the Najdorf, only now instead of this pawn being on e5, it's on e5, or on e6, excuse me. And so what this also allows us to do, it allows us to put our queen on d or c7 right here, and defend from any pawn push that would open the board on e5. Notice that you can't play e5. We've got 1, 2, 3 pieces defending it. And if he wants to play this move immediately, it's no problem at all. We'll put him into that nice defensive position that we learned about before. And while it looks that white is getting a menacing attack, black has lots of options here. Again, we have this possible b5 to move this knight. We have the queen lined up against the king. We can at any point play knight to e5 and threaten to trade him off for this powerful bishop. One of the points of playing bishop to c4 in the Fischer-Sozin attack is that's a good piece that's aimed down on f7 against the Najdorf, which is why it makes a lot of sense for us to play e6 in response and play it against that bishop. We're nullifying something that's supposed to be a major strength for white in the position. Now, while this white knight is defending f3, it can't move. It has to continue to defend him, okay? And if he wants to push this pawn down, it's fine. We'll go ahead and basically force this bishop to be traded. If he doesn't want to trade the white bishop and he just moves his queen, we can't move there because then we just take the bishop. He moves the queen over to here. Now we can trade off this other bishop, which is the major attacking piece in most English and Yugoslav attack openings, because it forms a battery with the queen and can easily come down and attack. So either way, we would be getting a strategic win for black by trading off that knight for one of the bishops. Now we have achieved the famous advantage of having the bishop pair, right? It's usually better to have 2 bishops than for your opponent to have 1 bishop and 2 knights, because the bishops can control both colored squares and you can do a lot of good with that. So basically, while black isn't necessarily winning in this position and white still may have an attack, it's much more difficult for white to attack, and for black we are getting equalization with our own counter-attacking chances. Now let's say we want to knock this knight back. If he moves over here to h3, we can trade it off, or we can just leave him there. It's fine. It doesn't really matter. We have the option of trading him. We can set up our pieces across from the king, and we have a good game here. He may continue to come down, and at this point you'll just do a lot of calculating to see if the threat is real, what can we do to counterattack, look at all these different move orders and options, and just see what it is we can do. We might want to just open up the center at this point and trade, just depending on our calculations and what can happen. Okay, so we can threaten this knight now because we got 2 pieces attacking it. He'll have to move it somewhere. He's got nowhere to go. So it looks like his knight is trapped in the situation actually. So we would have want to calculate that. So he can't go here, can't go here. We can take it, can't go back. So his knight would be trapped in the situation because our bishop can now take it. We would win a piece. Okay, so he would have hopefully calculated that because we're assuming we're playing against good chess players. So he would have to put his knight back here into a rough spot on the H file. Maybe he would just reroute it over here, but we would have gained time, and now we can push our pawns and attack this bishop. See? So now black has nice counterattacking chances on our own. If he wants to take another move to go over here, we can basically force this bishop to be traded off. Actually, in this case, it would be trapped. See? And so that he's going to have to move one of these pawns in order to save his bishop, basically. So he'll do something like this. Let's say play a3, and now we are the ones that are drawing first blood and opening up the position on this side, and we can have a lot of threats now. We can make him go back here. We can move a rook over and aim it here, set up some threats with the queen, and things like that. Okay, so lots of attacking chances we see for both sides, but if you are black playing against white in the Najdorf, and they play the Fischer-Sozen attack, you generally do not want to go ahead and continue with e5, okay? You want to play e6, and you want to transpose into a really solid Scheveningen. This is basically, start as a Najdorf, transpose into a Scheveningen, which is what you have when you have your pawns on d6 and on e6. And then with this pawn on a6, it restrains all their pieces, as we've seen in multiple different scenarios now. It allows for b5. It allows for very harmonious queenside expansion. And again, when you play the Sicilian Defense, in almost all of the endgame scenarios that you will end up in, if you don't mess your pawn structure up too much, you will have an advantage in the endgame because your pawn structure is usually better. White gets an early attacking chance typically, and if you can defend it, you get counterattacking chances, and or you will have a good endgame when all the pieces are traded off. And so never be afraid to trade off the pieces and go into an endgame. When you're a Sicilian Defense player, you'll get a lot of winning endgame positions, and you just got to be prepared for their pawn storm to come down and know how to defend it. Don't freak out. Trade off some pieces and get your own momentum going on the queen side. This is a really typical example of something that you might see. And as always, make sure you're calculating deeply between each move. In chess, we don't want to make any assumptions, right? We don't assume our opponent's going to play the move that we think they're going to play. We have to calculate and make sure that we're playing forcing chess. Only moves that are forcing. And look at your opponent's best moves. Always try to find your opponent's absolute best moves against you. This is one of the biggest weaknesses of lower level players, is that you're looking for what you can do and you're not fully looking for what your opponent can do to you, because it's not as fun to calculate all of your opponent's moves and play defense. But if you want to be a strong chess player, you have to do that. Look for their strongest moves just as actively as you would look for your strongest attacking moves, and then you will be playing forcing chess and you will become a much stronger chess player. So now we're going to take a look at the Scheveningen. We kind of looked at it in the last lecture when we transposed from the Najdorf into the Scheveningen, but this time, instead of playing a6, we just play e6 immediately, and we go into that very strong defensive sort of setup. You're basically saying, okay, come attack me, and good luck with that. And in the meantime, you know that you're going to have a lot of counterattacking chances and a really good endgame. And especially these kind of openings are good to have in your repertoire if you're playing against someone who's really used to seeing e5 as a response to e4. They want to go into an Italian or a Spanish or a Gioco piano or four knights opening, something like that. You play the Sicilian, maybe they're familiar with a few lines of the Sicilian, they've seen the dragon, they've seen this or that, but when you have the Scheveningen and the Najdorf in your back pocket, you know these variations, especially in blitz, you're going to get a lot of really good positions because your opponents will be less prepared than you. And that's the goal of studying the openings, right? Be more prepared than your opponent. So, as I said, instead of playing a6, we play e6. And then what we usually have in the Scheveningen, if white is first in the opening, is instead of playing the English attack or some of the other attacks that we've learned, although you still can play the English attack, they will go into a different setup, which I will show you now. This one is known as, it's known as the Characterized attack, depending on the move order that you play, or it's just the main line of the Scheveningen. So we're going to kind of look at the main line of Scheveningen, which I showed you part of in a previous lecture. So we're going to go ahead and get castled early here. And usually, instead of playing queen to d2 immediately, depending on the move order, white can play bishop to e2, say we castle, and then play an early f4. And so in this case, they're trying to take control of the center, which we basically let them do by not playing the Najdorf, by not playing the dragon. It looks like we're setting up in a way that is very passive, but the Scheveningen is very solid, and it also allows for good counter-attacking chances. Now we may want to play this Najdorf move a6, but the move order is the only thing that makes it different from the Najdorf. We played basically, if we play a6, now we're playing a Scheveningen with a Najdorf move, whereas before we played a Najdorf move and then we transpose it into Scheveningen. The real move that makes it a Najdorf after you play a6 is the e5 pawn push. So the two openings are really similar. It's kind of it's a move order thing, but the results after some of those transpositions will be very different positions depending on what white plays. So let's say we want to play out our knight out to here, and black will usually, or white will usually castle short in this case. Once he's played f4, he wants to have a rook behind this, and he's going to eventually attack either on e5 or on f5. And so what we do here in this case, there's a couple different ways that we can do it. We usually want our queen to be on c7 so that we are defending this central pawn push. Then if they play d5, we have our pawn, our knight, and our queen defending it. So we have three pieces defending it. So it's very solid. We can just take it. So it makes it so they can't do that so easily, and they have to wait before they make their pawn push. And while they're waiting, they'll have to rearrange their pieces and bring them over to the king side, while we also have time to rearrange our pieces. So you can either play queen to c7 right now, in which case a lot of amateur players will go like this with their knight and attack the queen, but you can actually just put it on b8, which kind of looks like the Chinese dragon a little bit, and then just make his knight move with the next move. So let's say, for example, if he wants to move his queen over, we can just make his knight move back, and then we can just gain tempo here. So actually, if he does that, it ends up helping us because we'll knock him back, and then we have, again, as we've seen in many scenarios, we have this pawn to b4 move that we can make his knight move and get our pawns rolling on the queen side. And the queen's actually not in a bad position right here, even though it looks like we don't normally want to have our queen on the back rank. It's helping to support pawn push. It's also continuing to defend this important e5 square here. Although in this case, we actually would drop a knight, I just noticed. So we have to be careful about that. We just wouldn't move that b5 pawn yet. So once he went back, we would either trade off this knight right here, or we would defend it first with the bishop, for example. And let's say he wants to move his queen over. Now we do have this move. Actually, we don't. Now we can move this forward, and if he wants to take the knight, it's fine. We just take back with the bishop, and now actually that helped us. So you got to be really careful when you're making trades when you're the attacking side. It may help develop your opponent's pieces and get rid of your attacking pieces. So in general, we want to keep our pieces on the board when we're the attacker. We want to get the pieces off the board if we are the defender. Okay, so this is a really typical scenario, but if we don't want to play queen to c7 right away and allow the knight to come down, it's just a choice of mood order. We can play the a6 move first, and then we can play this queen move. Put it right there. It's a really logical spot to be. Still aims down the board, but the main reason we want the queen here in the Scheveningen is to defend from white pushing this pawn down and hitting us here. So it's a really strong place for it to be. A typical maneuver for white in the Scheveningen is also to rearrange their bishop here to f3. What they do by doing that is they're both defending this pawn and also preparing for later on, if it makes sense, to push pawn to e5. And even though we're defending that square, now it opens up this bishop onto this diagonal. Depending on what we have done with our pieces, it can be a nice setup. It can also allow the bishop to later on in the attack it's going to move down and be flexible. And so let's say we just set up our pieces in normal fashion. Now white's got a pretty good attack here. They can choose to either push this pawn on the f file forward or the e pawn forward, and we are looking to defend. We're defending all those things, and we're looking to expand as usual. So again, we have a really similar type of a Sicilian defense setup, and that's good. We know what we're trying to achieve. We're going to have queenside expansion. We're going to be playing some defense, but each position is different, and each position will be more or less comfortable for you depending on how well you know the themes. So one of the key things to know is just which setup to choose depending on what your opponent does, right? If they go into the Fischer-Sozen attack with the bishop, we play e6 and we go into a Scheveningen. Okay, if we want to avoid the English attack and all those different openings, I think in the Najdorf or against the Adams attack, which now has shown to be really effective against the Najdorf, just play the Scheveningen instead. Or play the Dragon if you're prepared to defend if they play the Yugoslav attack, right? So it's a matter of preference for you and which opening you feel most comfortable with. But when you're well versed in all of them, you will get a good position no matter what because you have chosen the correct line for the most concrete, strongest lines against each opening setup. And so just to continue a few more moves to see what might happen here, white can pawn storm right now. They can look to just immediately try to open this position up. A lot of times, as I said, the best thing to do is ignore it. In this case, we might want to actually take and just trade pieces off if you were to do that. And notice that this piece trade is beneficial for black. Now we have a lot of things opening up and their attack is gone. So again, you want to be patient when you're the attacking side. You don't want to necessarily push your pawns forward until you are ready. Let's see what happens if we push this pawn forward. We simply capture. Takes, takes, takes. So in this case, we had enough pieces to defend. You can make this dangerous pin, but then of course we can trade because it's with check. And again, the attack is pretty much done for if he chose to make such an early pawn thrust. Okay, and so the lesson for the attacker is to be patient and wait till you have more pieces before you make these pawn pushes. And the lesson for the defender is to be calm and just make sure that you've got all your bases covered. White might instead choose to move their rook over and double their rooks on this right here, or they can play h4 and look to attack this way. Maybe move the queen over. So for example, we do something like this, move the queen over here. They wouldn't want to do that actually, they would lose material. But oftentimes, moving your queen out of the way and then pushing these other pawns forward, maybe by going there, can be a good thing to do. Something like this. And now the attack is coming with lots of pawns and lots of pieces all on the king side. That's another thing that may happen in this opening. Okay, so just another example. You've got to play it a lot to get familiar with how things will go down. And notice this is a very dangerous situation to be in right here for black. But our setup is solid and we have counterattacking chances. And so you've got to go out and practice it, see what happens in your games, and feel free to post in the discussion after you play with these openings. Tell us what your results were. Share some PGNs in the discussion board and share with the community so that other students of the course can benefit from the experience you had in your games. So now we're going to take a look at the English attack against the Scheveningen, excuse me. We kind of already looked at it in the Najdorf because it transposes a lot, but it's slightly different oftentimes in the Scheveningen. And we'll see that it's a different setup for both sides than in the Dragon because you have not fianchetted your bishop. And it actually leads to like a more solid position for black with slightly fewer attacking chances. So let's just take a look at that and see what may come out of it and what you need to watch out for. Okay, so normal moves. And notice they don't play their bishop out this time, their white bishop, they leave it at home. They're not going to go on the Fischer-Sozen line. They're not going to play against f7. They want to play with the English attack setup. And this is pretty much what I always play when I'm white against a Sicilian because I've played so many games and analyzed it so deeply with the Yugoslav attack and the English attack. Basically, the formation that we see with the bishop on e3 and then the queen on d2 and then the queen side or the king side pawn storm by white. It's very effective against all forms of the Sicilian. And when you played thousands of games and looked at tons of variations, you get really, really good at it. So I kind of figure, well, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. And I play it almost exclusively. Although if I see the Najdorf, now I play the Adams attack. And the Adams attack just gets you a really good position almost no matter what. And so actually the Adams attack is making it so some people are avoiding playing the Najdorf and then they play the Scheveningen instead. But if you play the Scheveningen, now you've got to worry about the Characterized attack and other things like that. So there's always a constant battle between the choice of openings between yourself and your opponent. And the person with the deepest knowledge will usually have an advantage in the game. Okay, so we see the regular Scheveningen moves. We don't play a6 yet. We take all of our time to get the center set up and get a solid foundation. And by not fianchetting our bishop like in the dragon, we have a slightly more solid defense. And even though it will seem like white's attack comes quickly with the pawns coming down, we can also get ours rolling pretty fast depending on the move order. So a typical thing is white, if they're a good player, they'll usually move their king over and improve that position. It's worth taking a move to do this, and if you look at lots of Grandmasters games, they almost always do it, as I explained before, because in some positions, if we trade off this knight, put the queen on a5, this knight can't move without the queen's being forced to trade off, and if the king's there, it's a trade with check, and the knight doesn't have this nice in-between move that we learned before, where they can get a piece in this case with a check. And so it just benefits them to move their king over. So if they do take a move to do that, it also gives us a little more time. We'll now play a6, so none of these pieces can come over here, and we can start our pawns rolling. So typically they'll play g4, although as I've told you before, they can play h4 first instead. It just depends on the move order that you like. h4 is slightly faster, and it puts the pressure. They can just push this pawn down and immediately try to get the king opened up, but it's a little bit easier to defend. But if they play g4 first, they're going to have a stronger pawn storm, and it's going to be slightly slower. So again, we see that everything in chess, when you do something that gains you one thing, you give something else. h4 gains you speed, but it gives up maybe a little bit of effectiveness. g4 is a little slower, but you're going to have a stronger attack once you do get to the king. So it's a matter of preference and what you choose to play at that particular time. So here, we can play b5, typical maneuver. It looks like their pawns are coming down pretty fast, but we're not worried about their pawn making our knight move. We'll put that knight into a nice defensive position, and we'll worry about expanding on the queen side. If we just freak out and worry about what our opponents do, and we see ghosts with every move, then we're going to move prematurely, and we're going to be letting them have their way with us. And we don't want to be worried about every little thing. We want to calculate and see that there's no danger yet. Also, they haven't moved this light squared bishop yet. They're going to have to take a move to move that bishop. They haven't connected their rooks. So by moving really quickly to do the pawn storm, they're slightly underdeveloped, whereas our development is really good. A little trick here, if we want to, is we can just trade off this knight. It makes sense for us oftentimes as black to do this. As I said in a different lecture, it doesn't make any sense for white to trade because this knight is slightly stronger than ours. It's in a better central position. It's already moved twice. And by taking this and letting them trade and put that bishop there, now we can move our queen either to c7, or we can put our queen on a5 if we want to, and again, threaten to trade queens and go into an endgame with a really good structure and try to win it that way. They can also leave this knight here and not trade queens, in which case we can continue by pushing our pawns. We have our bishop aimed at their king as well, and we have a pretty good attack coming ourselves. Or if we want to be a little more conservative, we simply put the queen on c7 across from this c2 pawn, and maybe we line up some rooks there. And what that does is it makes it so either the rook has to stay home and defend, or this queen has to be very careful where they move to. Otherwise, if a couple of their pieces move when they're trying to attack us, we can hit them here on h7. So we always want to have threats, right? If they move this knight, make this knight move, basically we have only one place to go, but it's a place that defends. So it's not a bad place for a knight to be defending this pawn. We just leave it there, and it will take him time to get his pawns down. He wants to keep the pawn storm going. Okay, well now we can start ours. Now we knock his knight off. He kind of blocks that bishop in a little bit. And now our pawn storm is coming quickly as well, only our queen's in a slightly better position actually. They have taken the time to move these pawns down, but they haven't gotten all their pieces ready. So this is a good example of how you want to make sure that you coordinate all of your pieces in attack. Otherwise, even if they get their pawns on here, it's not necessarily going to do anything. So there's lots of ways that this game can play out now. We can't look at every single variation, but needless to say, you can tell that both sides have a good game, have a good attack, and you just have to decide what the best moves are. It might make sense for white to move this knight forward somewhere. Can't go here, right, because he'll lose a piece to this fork. So you always got to be careful about that when you move your knight a couple squares over for your bishop if there's a pawn going on. So you have to move it, maybe move his knight here, and then maybe later move his bishop out to here. That might be a couple moves that he can do to prepare for the attack. It's probably premature for him to just go ahead and go like this and attack our king, in which case we can do a couple things. We can just ignore it, let him take, and leave that pawn there as a blockade. We can go here and stop it, in which case if he takes like that, it's looking a little bit dangerous now. We have to worry a little bit about some of this stuff. Yeah, that's not good. So we got to calculate all of our moves. Like when he puts a pawn here, we got to calculate all those different variations. What happens if he goes here? What happens if he goes here? What happens if we take it with this one? In general, we don't want to open our king. So whatever closes the king best is going to be the move that we're going to want to make. We probably don't want to take it immediately because then this is really ugly. And later on, he can attack this and he can move his queen over. Really dangerous. So you want to do whatever you can to keep your king closed, okay, and defend. Okay, we might even do something like go like this with a knight and just ignore that pawn. If he trades off the bishop, that's good. That'll put our bishop in a really good square, aimed at their king and defending this. And now, if he takes that pawn, we can just take it with the knight. And even though he's going to continue attacking, now we can look to make some trades. We might even go like this, block that bishop out, and look to maybe even do something like this. Play f5 and attack the center. Remember, in chess, we have to be following a plan and know the opening, but we also have to be flexible. So whereas normally the Sicilian, we will be attacking on the queen side, if our opponent allows us to defend well by not having all their pieces ready. So you notice that these pieces are not doing anything, this knight and this bishop, because we knock them back with our moves and they attack prematurely. Often we'll get a position like this where we'll have a nice counterattack. And if he makes a mistake and trades off, now all of a sudden our pieces are way more active and black has a better game here. Now, if he doesn't take this pawn, we also have the threat of playing f4 and gaining space and knocking his bishop back. So this is a really good example of how, again, white attacked prematurely and we end up with a better game. If they don't attack prematurely, well, then we just have more time to move our pieces. So let's say we do the same thing. We go here without him playing that move. Instead, maybe he does something like he puts his bishop here. Maybe now we push his pawn forward. He moves the knight back. But now his pieces are more coordinated. Just by taking one more move to move that bishop out, now he's got both of his rook behind his pawn. And we can do the same thing. We can have a similar attack as him. And now it's going to be more effective for him to play this move because he has time. And we can do the same thing. And he'll want to be patient. It's almost always better to be patient and build up a really good attack before touching the king. Because if your opponent can just trade everything off, you may not have accomplished anything. And we're going to want to attack ourselves, open the position up, and this is going to be a race. It's going to be a race to see who's got a better attack, who has the best moves, and it'll be interesting. You know, who knows? I'm just showing how the pieces move. This is going to be really, really complicated. And at this point, you're going to want to calculate a lot and make sure that with every pawn exchange, you're not getting the worst end of it. So this is where calculation comes into play. The opening, usually, it's all about knowing the moves, knowing the patterns and themes and what you're trying to get. And then once you get into the middle game, you're going to want to slow down and calculate. And even if you're playing like a 10-minute blitz game, that's another reason why you want to know the openings so well. So that later on in the game, when you get to some sort of position like this, you can stop and use up, a couple minutes on one move, because that one or two moves, whatever happens next, is going to be maybe the deciding factor between winning and losing. So you're going to calculate a lot. And that's part of managing the clock. Obviously, it's harder to manage the clock in a blitz game if you're only playing 10 minutes. So you want to be really economical, and you want to make quick moves when you know that they're probably best, which is why we're studying openings. And then you want to take your time when it gets complicated. It's the same thing when you're playing longer games. You want to conserve your time during the opening, and then at key points in the game, you might take, if you're playing like a 30-minute game, you might take 10 whole minutes. That's 1/3 of the game on just one critical move. If the calculation is really, really important, you'll stop and make sure that you make a really strong move at that point. Otherwise, the game could be lost, and that one move might be what wins you the game. And so this is something that really strong players do. They know how to manage the clock, and it's really important. Sometimes it's okay to get in time trouble at the end if you made really, really strong moves and you used your time to find the best moves. A lot of really strong players, they get in time trouble a lot. They get down to the point where the time's running low, but they've got a really good position. And it's better to lose on time than it is to make some bad move and some blunder, some huge mistake because you were worried about the clock. So that's just another thing to think about in terms of time management, and it's yet another reason why you need to be really good in the openings. So the Keres attack is named after a really famous grandmaster named Paul Keres, who many consider to be one of the strongest, if not the strongest grandmaster in history, never to have won a world title. He played at a time when there was a lot of stiff competition at the top ranks among grandmasters, and he never quite got to the grand prize of being a world champion. But he made this really nice innovation in the Scheveningen, which made a lot of players choose the Najdorf and not play the Scheveningen. This is one of the reasons why a lot of players favored the Najdorf over the Scheveningen, was because of this particular line. So sometimes a new variation, a new move, will basically refute one opening so well that if your opponent knows it, it almost makes it not worth it or not fun to play that, which is why, again, Fischer and Kasparov favor the Najdorf so much, because of its flexibility. You can go into so many different lines no matter what your opponent does, that it just makes sense to play that particular opening a lot. So in the Scheveningen, the best way to play against it for white, if you want to have a big attack, according to grandmasters, and if you look this up, you'll see from databases that white scores really well with the Keres attack. And so it's on move 6, you play g4. It's very aggressive and it looks kind of crazy, but you'll see from some examples of what can happen if your opponent is not really careful. So let's go through the moves again. We go into Scheveningen, and then white says, oh, the Scheveningen, huh? Keres attack, g4. And so if black doesn't respond very well to this and doesn't know what to do, they might just continue to develop normally and play this knight out and basically let their knight get pushed. And there's not really a great place to put the knight. You can block in this bishop up here, you can put it back to the original spot, and now white can immediately start pawn storming. And so basically what this does, it kind of forces black to either not castle or to castle queenside, but castling queenside when you're playing the Sicilian kind of goes against the purpose of the opening, because we are setting ourselves up to castle kingside and then expand on the queen side. So it kind of puts black into a dilemma. Do I want to go into a really dangerous situation where this pawn storm is already coming at the very beginning of the game, or do I want to leave myself uncastled? It's kind of tricky. So a lot of times black will just try to trade off pieces, do something like this, bring the queen out, try to trade queens. Of course, we know that we should avoid trading in this case, so maybe we just move it all the way back. And white's attack here is going to be really dangerous. If black says, you know what, I'm probably fine, I've got this nice pawn structure, I'm going to just play normally, that could be a really big mistake. Now this queen can come down, castle. Now just look how dangerous this is. It's going to be really, really hard to defend this. Now this was a pretty weak play from black, basically not recognizing the danger that they were going to be in. But white is in no danger. There's nothing that can happen quickly to them, even though they haven't castled yet, and black's development is kind of gummed up. So it's a really good surprise attack if you are white playing against black in the Sicilian. They choose the Sicilian and they go into the Scheveningen trying to avoid either the dragon or the Najdorf, and you say, you play g4, Paul Keres attack, and it's really, really dangerous. You're going to get a really good game. Usually, most opponents are not going to be prepared for this g4 move. I don't see it a lot when I play the Scheveningen for whatever reason, even at relatively higher levels of the game when I'm playing people ranked 2,000 and above. A lot of people, for some reason, they don't tend to play the Keres attack. They go for the more known lines of the English attack or the Fischer-Sozen attack or what have you. And so it makes it a really good surprise weapon, especially amongst relatively lower tournament level play. Okay, so we're playing black though. We want to know what to do against it. If you look up some of the Grandmaster games in the database, it appears that perhaps the strongest moves, instead of just taking out your knight like this and developing more, is to actually play h6. Just play h6, and then if they insist on pushing the pawn immediately, then you can trade it off. And it still might be a little bit awkward. They're going to have this nice pin on the queen, and even though you can break the pin by playing this bishop here, it still makes castling kind of weird, because now this h file is open. So you can do it this way, and you can block it in here, block this pin here, but we'll see that it's still pretty dangerous. Let's say we just continue normally again, and let's say we end up, or let's say we castle. Now white's got a pawn storm coming, and they can castle long. They can bring their queen over again, something like this. These are just examples. You guys will have to analyze the moves yourselves, but it's pretty dangerous now. And so having this open h file, it makes a big difference. So once again, it kind of makes it so black wants to avoid castling on that side. So it's a tricky thing, but you want to play this h6 move regardless. If they go here, basically you want to not castle this way, or you want to either avoid castling and leave your king in the center, or you want to castle on the queen side. So let's say you just continue normally. They continue with an attack. Move your queen over. So you're out of the pin. Now you're not really worried about if they take this knight and you double your pawns. You're not really worried about anything. You can just go like this. You can castle this long way, and it's fine because the attack has kind of been nullified. So they don't want to do that. They don't want to just trade off this knight. They're going to want to keep the pressure and continue to try to open the position with a pawn move and to attack. So you're going to have a really interesting game here. It's going to be very dynamic, but you want to play h3. That's the key thing to do. Let's say they move their queen over. They're gonna have an attack against you, but if you just castle long now their attack is not going to be on your king anymore. It will just be on your queen side, and it's going to be an interesting game. It's going to be different than a lot of different Sicilian positions. But if you don't play h6, it can be very, very dangerous. And as you saw from that example, if you're playing white against a Sicilian and your opponent doesn't know what to do, you can win in like a few moves. They can make a really big mistake, and it's really uncomfortable. I mean, look how it hurts their development, while white's pieces can come down really fast. I mean, if he wants to try to reroute the knight, he's making multiple moves. We can just move our rook over and try to push this up. It's not an easy way to get around this. That's why black will often have to trade off that knight. But that knight was actually black's most active piece. And so even though he can try to make this queen move or trade queens, we just move it back calmly, and we have an attack coming. We have these pawns coming. It's going to be dangerous. Okay, so really good surprise weapon to play against the Scheveningen, and the key move being g4 immediately after they play the Scheveningen. This has been powerful enough that it's made a lot of Scheveningen players say, you know what, I'm just going to play the Najdorf instead, because it's not fun to play against the Kara's attack and then have to worry about this castling conundrum that it causes. Okay, so it's a really secret weapon for white, and if you're black and you choose to play the Scheveningen is really solid against almost all lines, and very few people play the Kara's attack. They don't seem to know it, but if they do play it, play h6 and then castle queenside, and you're going to be fine. You're going to have a decent game. It's going to be an interesting game, a fight for the center. Maybe you'll have to play a little bit of defense on your king side, but your king will be safer, and you will avoid getting crushed by the Kara's attack, which a lot of people won't know how to do. So the Fischer-Sozin attack in the Scheveningen is really similar to what we learned about the Najdorf. Usually we'll transpose from a Najdorf into a Scheveningen. There's a couple different variations, a couple different move orders and different lines that we should definitely look at and just see some different ways to play it. Okay, so the move order, I'm going to show the typical move order. This time I'm going to make the knight go to c6 because people who play the Sicilian, you can choose to play d6 or you can play knight to c6. This is actually a slightly older move, and almost all of the openings will transpose into the same exact lines, but it is common to see this move as well, so you can choose to mix it up sometimes. Instead of playing d6, you can play knight to c6. It avoids the bishop coming down if they want to and giving you a check, right? When you just play d6, they can make a check here, which doesn't matter because if you want to trade that bishop off or just block it with a knight, this is one of white's good pieces. So if they want to make a check and then trade that off, which is basically inevitable, if you block it and they don't take it, you can put the question to the bishop here with this pawn move. If he backs up, you can knock it back and it will be trapped. So it'll pretty much be forced to take either your knight or your bishop if you block with that. So we're not ever worried about this check move, in case you guys are wondering about that, right? If we play d6, he makes a check there, we block it, it doesn't matter. They're giving away a good piece for one of our undeveloped pieces. So it's a trade that doesn't make very much sense at all from white's point of view. Okay, so typical moves. We play the knight out, and notice one of the things about having this knight here is that it doesn't allow this pawn to come down and knock our knight off. That's one of the reasons why, as I explained before, we also oftentimes want to position the queen here. It's very flexible, it puts pressure on this file, and it defends from some of these pawn moves. And if a knight is able to come here and seemingly gain a tempo by threatening our queen, we just back it up and then knock the knight off. So they gain nothing by doing that, so we're not afraid of that. Remember in chess, if you see one move ahead, you see something that your opponent can do, like threaten one of your pieces and maybe making a move, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't make that move. In chess, we don't make assumptions. So that means that you got to calculate and see, okay, if he goes there, where can you put your piece? Are there any good forcing moves that can come out of that? We don't make any assumptions. You want to calculate every variation as far as you can. So that means at least 2 or 3 moves, at the very, very minimum, every single time you're thinking of a move. Look at least 2 or 3 moves from both you and your opponent into the future. Okay, so the Fischer-Sozin attack we know is they take the bishop out because they want to bear down on f7. The best way to combat that is to play e6, and this is how in this move order we get into the Scheveningen because we are playing against that bishop. So that's why we're not going to play the Najdorf because the bishop is on c4. They'll use a regular continuation, get their bishop out, defend this knight, put that in a good spot, and we will play d6, which allows us to get our bishop out, and it guards this square. The reason that we play this move in the Sicilian is because we want to stop this pawn from coming down, and if we have the queen here, we have the knight here, we have the pawn here, we have 3 pieces defending this square. And so probably white's going to end up having to push this pawn and attack this square if they're not doing the English attack or Yugoslav attack with the queen on d2 and then castling long. As we briefly saw in a previous lecture, they're going to set up kingside, and they're going to play f4. Now, the move order here varies. Someone might be really aggressive and play f4 immediately, but the cost in doing this is they haven't developed their knight yet, which could end up being troublesome later. We want to develop all of our pieces. So instead of playing f4, someone can play the knight to c3 here first, allow us to castle, and then play f4. So it just depends. Again, you have to calculate. Every time you play this opening, even if it seems like the moves are all the exact same as before, there may be a slight change in move order. There may be one tiny difference that changes the position and allows a tactic or allows you to get a piece to a better square. Every single move in chess is important. And the reason people like Bobby Fischer rise to the very, very top ahead of even other grandmasters is because they make the absolute most of every single move. They make their moves efficiently. They do multiple things at the same time. They coordinate their pieces more harmoniously. They are choosing plans that are more effective, and you combine all of that together, and it makes for a winning combination. It's one of the things that makes chess so difficult. Anybody can learn the moves, and anybody can study it, but being able to defeat other strong players means you have to calculate better, you have to understand the openings better, and you have to make fewer mistakes. And that's what this is all about. So we'll play knight to c3 eventually. Maybe we'll put the queen here. Again, we already learned that we're not worried in the Scheveningen, but then putting a knight on b5, we'll just tuck the queen back and then make that knight move and play a6. So it actually helps us. They think that they're gaining a tempo on our queen. We put into a good square. We're still defending this e5 square with the queen by being behind the pawn. And we're also allowing ourselves to, after we play a6, just look at it one more time. Go here, depending on what they do, maybe they're getting ready to bring their queen over to the attack position. We just make the knight move back. He's got nowhere to go. He's got to go back. So we gain nothing, and then we can gain a tempo on the bishop and expand there. And our queen's actually not in a bad spot right here, even though we usually want the queen and most of our pieces to be centralized. In this situation, it's doing some things that we'd like it to do, and he actually helped us right there with our development. So again, the theory here is that white's going to be attacking. Since we have this e5 square covered, at some point he's probably going to play f5. This is very typical. If you're white, you're going to want to look for ways to attack here, and if you're black, you're going to look for ways to defend. We have a pretty good defense as long as we're careful. And whenever it comes to these pawn trades, you simply have to calculate a lot, okay? We don't want to let him take this pawn here in this case because he's got 3 attackers and we only have 2 defenders, and after he takes, we take, he's going to win a pawn with an attack. So we'll either be forced to play e5, and maybe he'll trade off this knight, but then we'll have this backwards pawn. It probably isn't a good thing to do. As I've mentioned to you before, we usually want to relieve the pressure when we're playing defense and trade. So in this case, we'd probably want to trade it off. And even though it allows him to kind of get his pieces going and get his queen over here, we have time to defend. We can move our rook over maybe, and we can get our knight maybe to this nice square right here and defend. This is not such an easy attack for him now that he's traded it off. So, I mean, he does have some chances here, but the key for the attacker is to be patient, as I will keep telling you. So this premature f5 here may not have been a great idea. Probably it would have been better for white to continue to develop his pieces and for black to do the same before making the attack. Get pieces moved around to better squares, look for a time when it's appropriate to make that pawn move. In the meantime, we can also advance our pieces. Or it may, depending on what they do, be appropriate for us to make a pawn move forward. Usually we don't want to do that. We want to keep it flush. We want to keep it solid. But if their attack's coming and it looks dangerous, based on our calculations, we might want to push a pawn forward and force some trades and some action and get this center open. Like for example, if we're going here, they could close us down and go here, which is probably the best move. So we want to calculate that and think, okay, maybe that's not a good move. But we can calculate if takes, or in this case, actually we'd probably take with our knight because it's not easily removed. And now we have our knight in a good square. And then if he tries to trade off the knights, we can put him in this nice defensive spot. So again, probably premature from white's point of view to open that up, although they still have some activity and pressure on this side. Every game is going to be different. They've got a lot of pieces on the side near our king. So this is going to be an interesting and fun game to play. We don't have such a bad position ourselves. We have some nice space on the queen side. We can also do some things, try to maybe trade the queens off. We can play d5 right here and threaten to trade queens. Anytime you're in the defensive position, which basically in the Scheveningen, you're automatically in the defensive position, pretty much in all Sicilians actually. It's a good idea sometimes to trade off queens and then go for a winning endgame. And it's just a good choice if you want to avoid having to play d5, e5 at the very beginning and everything like that. So let's go back to the beginning. I want to show you guys a couple other variations on this, on how it can play out. I showed you the knight to c6. This time we're going to play the old move, which is actually the newer move, but the move that's old to us in the class, so I've been showing it to you. Make the trade, make the knight moves come out. He's going to play this, so get the bishop out immediately. And at this point, the pawn's already on d6. We'll play e6 against the bishop. You want to get that bishop out. We want to get our bishop out. And some people will just play f4 right here right away. Just get that move in. doesn't really matter. We have no threats. Black has no threats against white right now. I mean, we could make a check right here with the queen, but that would do nothing. I mean, he could literally just block it and make us move our queen back, or just put the knight there. So that doesn't really achieve anything for us. There's an old saying in chess, passer sees check, passer plays check. Right? We don't want to make a check just because there's a check. It doesn't necessarily do anything in this situation. We have to think about, is that the place that we want our queen to be? Do we want our queen to be on that square? Maybe we do, but if he just moves his bishop back to d2, we got to move it again. So it's kind of a wasted move. We'll just castle. And then he'll castle. And you have a transposition into the opening that we saw before. It's very, very similar. Now notice this time I move my knight first instead of my queen. And that slight change in move order changes things. Because if he chooses to trade, now the position is different. If he chooses to take this knight and we take back with this pawn, now our pawn structure is different. We've got to open b file, which ends up actually usually being pretty good for black, because we can put a rook right here, and then if we trade off all the pieces, we've got a really good endgame pawn structure, and we'll have some pressure on the queen side. We will probably make him have to react by moving a rook over, moving his pawn down, and so trading this knight off usually for white is not a very good idea. Also, you'll notice this knight has moved twice. It's in the center of the board, which is where we want it. So it makes no sense for white to trade this knight for our knight, which we only moved once, and it's in almost a starting position. So if he trades that, it helps us. It hurts his position, it helps us. It makes no sense. White's the attacker with the initiative. It makes no sense for him to willy-nilly trade pieces. So you never want to worry about those types of trades. Okay? We can simply continue in our regular line. And sometimes, just so we can show you, sometimes white will be really aggressive, and they'll even play g4 here. It's defended by the queen. At this point, we may want to consider ways that we could just be aggressive ourselves and play this pawn forward, try to trade off this pawn, right? Or we capture this pawn. It'll force them to play this move, and then we'll look for some sort of break in the center and gain in the center. Or we can play a6 and b5 and knock them back. It's going to be a really interesting game here. They've got this move coming, so we might want to play h6. It's pretty dangerous, actually, when they attack this way. It's really aggressive. But if their attack fails and they don't successfully checkmate us or hurt us, their king is wide open. And so they have to be aggressive once they play g4. And that's just something else that you may see. So it's a fun opening. There's lots to do. But the Scheveningen is really solid. The two most effective attacks against it, as we've learned, are to play the Fischer or the Kariz attack, as we learned before. And you just have to know what to do against it as black, and you'll be fine. And remember, the main idea probably is to trade off the pieces and go for a winning endgame, which may not be like the sexiest approach in chess. We oftentimes just want to attack our opponent's king. But as black, when we play this, we're avoiding the regular e4, e5 openings. We're giving ourselves a chance on the queen side. And if your opponent is a very, very good Sicilian player and they get a good attack, trade off all the pieces and get a slight advantage and try to grind out a win in the endgame. If you're a strong player and you calculate well, you'll get a lot of wins as black with the Scheveningen and the Sicilian in general. The closed Sicilian is a really good option for a lot of white players that want to avoid the classic Sicilian lines, because most Sicilian players don't really know how to play it all that well. It seems like against closed Sicilian, they're not as used to seeing it. It's played more at the higher levels, actually, so I run into it a lot in tournaments, and it's a really solid opening. Instead of having that exchange on d4 of pawns that opens a position up and leads to all these variations that we've been learning in the course, it keeps the position closed, and it's a more slow positional game that you're going to have, more like a normal game of chess instead of like a big attack happening from white or black and all the tactics and sometimes chaos that can ensue in the Sicilian. So basically in the closed Sicilian, white opts to play knight to c3 here in this second move, and basically they're going to set their position up like a king's Indian attack for white, where they're going to fianchetto their king's bishop, and they're going to look to play f4 at some point and expand on the king side and attack the king. So white is still going to look to get a good attack on the king side, and black is going to look to expand on the queen side. but it's going to be a very different type of position. And so if you know how to play it for black, you can pretty much get equality pretty easy. And white is willing to give you that because they don't want to have the really sharp lines that can happen in Sicilian, where black is really well versed. They can get a nice counterattack or have a really complex, chaotic position where a lot of tactics can happen. Black wants something a little bit, or white wants something a little bit more tame. And maybe they want to surprise their opponent, right? As I've been saying, a lot of times you want to play something that you think your opponent won't know very well because it's easy for them to make a mistake. It's easy for you to get a good position. And again, if you're playing blitz, it'll save you time on the clock as well while you're basically making grandmaster strength moves. So we'll follow up in this case with knight to c6 usually, and they will immediately fianchetto their bishop. Instead of playing d4 and trading the pawn, they'll just leave that pawn there and they'll basically ignore it. This pawn right here is what I'm talking about, right? That's normally the one that we get traded off. They'll ignore that, they'll leave it there, and we will also fianchetto our bishop. Since we're aiming on the queen side, it makes sense for us to do this. And white is going into a King's Indian type of attack position in this case. So they'll put the knight on e2. We will develop normally. Both sides will castle. Notice it's a lot more slow. There's no immediately crushing pawn storm coming, and it's going to be much more strategic struggle. And then we might want to do something like d6. It depends on what you want to play. They will maybe play f4 immediately. This does allow us to play what seems to be kind of an annoying move, bishop to g4, and put a pin on this knight, but it doesn't really do anything because white can simply make it go back. We can't, in this case, put it on h5 because then it will be blocked and we'll lose a piece. So we would just have to retreat it. We get them to play h3, which slightly weakens their king side a little bit, but it's not really worth doing. So if you're playing this for white and you're worried about that move there, it's no problem. All you have to do is move this down. And if they trade off the knight, well, they just traded off one of their good pieces, a good bishop, for a knight for no reason. So it wouldn't benefit them. So it's just an example there. Usually the queen will reroute itself over to f2, or if you're going to play g3 or g3 to g4 here, the queen may also end up on g3, which is a really good square. So white is going to usually get a pretty good attack if they know what they're doing, but we're going to be pushing on the queen side too. One way to do that, as we saw in the Chinese dragon, is to move the rook over and play b4. This is a really good theme in lots of different Sicilian defense scenarios for black. So just another good thing to know. Move the rook over and push this pawn forward. So this is a typical situation we have. It kind of looks like a dragon, only instead of having the white king on the opposite side and a pawn storm coming, you have it more like a King's Indian attack where the king's on the same side as yours and the pawn storm is coming from that side. And so we're going to either try to defend it or simply ignore it for now and try to soften up their queen side and expand over here and gain some sort of strategic advantage. And it's worth noting that oftentimes it is not a good idea to move your pawns on the same side as your king and attack with pawns in front of your king. But we saw it with the Keres attack, and now we're seeing it here in the close Sicilian. And the reason it's okay in some scenarios is based on a couple different factors. If the center is closed, as in this case it is right now, although it could easily be opened up, we see in the King's Indian Defense, which we don't cover in this course obviously, a lot of times you'll have the pawn chain will be locked up because it'll be closed, and then you can oftentimes either just leave your king in the center, or you can castle and attack from the king side because if there's not an opening of the center, then your king is usually safe. In this case, the key factor is that your bishop is controlling this dark square diagonal, and so there's no way to like make a check on the king or to easily attack the king. We could also just move the king over as white over here and then move our rook over, and it's not in any danger. Okay, so if the center's closed, it's not in any danger, and usually if the bishop is on the same diagonal as your king, oftentimes you can advance this f pawn and attack this way, especially if your opponent is fianchettoed. As we saw in the dragon, the fianchettoed position is a little bit more vulnerable to an attack because of this pawn being up here, and because if the opponent can successfully trade off your dark squared bishop, then your king side is a little bit weaker than it otherwise would be. But we still choose to do it because when having a fianchettoed position, we have a really good, powerful piece in this bishop usually, and a lot of openings call for fianchetto bishop. So it makes it so that we can be familiar with all different kinds of chess positions, chess openings, where you fianchetto the bishop. So it's just a good thing to have as part of your repertoire, and it's generally an aggressive setup. It's something that you're going to be looking to attack with when you have a fianchetto bishop. So not fianchettoing is more defensive, and you have a slightly safer king, but it's more passive. And fianchetting the bishop is slightly more aggressive. You have slightly less safe king, but you're looking to attack. That's kind of the general attitude that you're having in the game. Okay, so we played b5 here. The knight can't really do anything. We're going to look to expand over here and maybe gain something. Notice that our bishop is aimed over here at the rook, at the queen side. Our rook is also aimed there now. We can bring our queen over. So black has a lot of good chances here, as does white. White might just move the queen over. The queen now has a battery with his bishop and with his rook. They're going to look to, at some point, either play f5 or first play g4 and then f5. In the meantime, we're not going to try to defend against that. We want to develop our own threats and our own pieces. So one thing we can do is we can bring our queen over here and make it so if this rook moves or this knight moves, we can make the knight move by playing b4 next. Then there are opportunities for us to win a pawn and to gain some advantage over here. So at this point, you need to do a lot of calculation. We can maybe blitz out a lot of these first moves because we know the opening, and depending on what your opponent does, you're going to be doing a lot of thinking. Your opponent may even want to reroute this knight all the way over here. If your opponent is really good, they're not going to attack immediately. They're going to take some time to move their pieces around so that when they do finally make an attack, it's a successful one. In the meantime, we can look to push forward and gain some sort of an advantage ourselves. Maybe we want to move this rook over and look to push this forward. Maybe they're going to move their queen forward, even maybe sacrifice a pawn in order to surprise your opponent. Lots of different things you can try to do, and have a good game. Aim at this weak pawn. Now you have this. Reroute your knight. So you have a really interesting and fun game. It's going to be a lot different than a lot of the other openings that we've seen. So you're going to want to know what to do against it. If you see this as black, just fianchetto your bishop and play almost like play a dragon sort of setup and look for queenside expansion. If you are playing white and you are tired of playing against the same old dragon or Najdorf or Scheveningen for whatever reason, or maybe you like closed positions better, or maybe you like the King's Indian defense or King's Indian attack fianchetto bishop positions, then this is a really good opening for white to play against the Sicilian, because oftentimes black won't know how to play against it very well, and they won't set up themselves the way that I'm showing you, which combats it quite nicely, because they're getting this expansion on the king side, we're getting this expansion on the queen side. If black misplays this position, for example, let's look at a way that black could misplay this position. He says, I'm just going to play a normal Sicilian. So instead of fianchettoing, maybe he just does something like this. He's used to white playing this d4 move all the time. So when he doesn't see it, he might get kind of confused and just sort of set his position up normally. Maybe he's going to go for a Scheveningen sort of setup. And meanwhile, we get all of our stuff ready. He hasn't fianchetted the bishop, and now we can play f4, and he's still going to have he can still play the same setup as he did before and look to push on the side, but the big difference is now he doesn't have a fianchetto bishop aiming at the queen side. So his expansion on the queen side is going to be somewhat less effective than it was before, and since this Scheveningen setup is closed, white can easily take the time to rearrange his pieces and maybe get a really dangerous sort of attack. Or he can even just strike the center immediately, because now he's got a lot of pieces aimed at the king. And so even if we want to sacrifice a pawn or something, now we can maybe get some dangerous attacking chances depending on how we want to play it. Okay, so it's a really fun opening to play for white. You can surprise your opponent in a lot of different ways, and I encourage you definitely to have it as your repertoire. Even if you only know what to do against it for black, the best idea is to fianchetto your bishop and play for queenside pressure. As you've learned throughout the course, the Sicilian Defense is a super versatile weapon to use as black against the first move white plays e4. It can befuddle your opponent if they're not used to seeing the main line variations of it, and you can oftentimes get a very, very good position out of the opening no matter what your opponent plays. And of course, as we learned in the course as well, if you know the lines as white, you can play it against black too. So it works for both sides. I told you guys before that I played one tournament where I played 6 long time control games, and every single game was a different line in the Sicilian Defense. We played the Dragon, we played the Najdorf, I had a Kara's attack, I had an Adams attack, and it was just very fun to play the same opening but have totally different games every time. And since my opponents knew the openings well themselves, it was very interesting and strategic as we grappled for advantage and sort of had a psychological war, choosing different lines and testing each other's knowledge. So it gets really fun as you start to get better at chess, and the opponents that you have know all the openings really well. They know the lines really well themselves, and it makes the game that much more fun and rewarding. So play a lot of games, test out all the theory, test out every single one of these variations, and especially with black, play the Dragon. It's just really fun. You're going to get a lot of attacking chances, and you're going to have a lot of success with it. There's so much tactical opportunity and so many interesting nuances in this game that it never gets old, and you will never have the same game twice. With chess, you have to just play a lot and calculate hard, and basically don't take anything for granted. As I've said throughout the course, don't make any assumptions about what your opponent is going to do. Look for in-between moves. Look for moves that at first might seem kind of strange, but you have to calculate. You can't make any assumptions in chess. And if you do that and you play the Sicilian, you're going to have a lot of fun, and you're going to improve your rating by hundreds of points. And please feel free to ask any questions, anything that you're confused about in the discussion board, so that I can answer it for both yourself as well as other students of the course to benefit. And good luck out there with your games.